When we last left Waldo, he was no longer the timid boy who once feared the world. On that wild island, he had faced hunger, danger, and death, and through it all, one woman stood beside him, Nadera, the fierce and untamed girl who taught him how to survive. But the deeper their bond grows, the more brutal the world around them becomes. Enemies are gathering, secrets buried in the island's past are about to surface, and soon, Waldo will learn that the greatest battle isn't against nature. It's against the truth of who he really is. Welcome to the Cave Girl Part 2. Stay close, because this is where survival becomes destiny. Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, scion of the aristocratic house of the John Alden Smith-Jones of Boston, clambered up the rocky face of the precipitous cliff with the agility of a monkey, his right hand clasping the slim brown fingers of his mate. He assisted her over the more dangerous stretches. At the summit, they turned their faces back toward the sea. Beyond the gently waving forest trees stretched the broad expanse of shimmering ocean, and upon a tiny harbor lay a graceful yacht. For the first time, the man obtained an unobstructed view of the craft. Before, when they had discovered it, the boles of the forest trees had revealed it only in part, but now he saw it fully from stem to stern, shining against the deep water. The shock of recognition brought an involuntary exclamation from his lips. The girl looked quickly up into his face. "What is it, Thander?" she asked. "What do you see, the yacht?" He whispered. "It is the Priscilla my father's. He is searching for me. And you wish to go?" For some time he did not speak, only stood there gazing at the distant yacht. And the young girl at his side remained motionless and silent, watching the expression upon his face with a look of dumb misery upon her own. Quickly, through the man's mind, ran the gamut of his past. He recalled his careful upbringing, the time, the money, the fond pride expended upon his education. He thought of the result, the weakling coward that had been washed upon this savage shore. And yet it had been love, solicitous and tender, that had prompted his parents. He was their only son. They were doubtless grieving for him. In their declining years, it appeared pathetic that they should be robbed of the happiness of his return. But could he ever return to the bookish existence that once had seemed so pleasant? Had not this brief year of wild, primitive life made impossible a return to the narrow, self-centered existence? Had it not taught him the truth about living? It had taught him to want life at first hand, not through the proxy of the printed page. It and Nadara. He glanced toward the girl. Could he give her up? No. 1,000 times, no. He read in her face the fear within her heart. He owed to her all that he was proud of: his mighty physique, his new courage, his woodcraft, his ability to cope, primitively, with the primitive world, her savage world, which he had learned to love. No, he could not give her up. But what then? His gaze lingered upon her sweet face. Slowly there sank into his understanding something of the reason for his love of this wild, half-savage cave girl, other than the primitive passion of the sexes. He saw now not only the physical beauty of her face and figure, but the sweet, pure innocence of her girlishness. And most of all, the wondrous tenderness of her love of him mirrored in her eyes. To remain and take her as his mate, after the manner and customs of her own people, would reflect no shame upon either. But was she not deserving of the highest honor at the altar of her love? She, his wonderful Nadara, must become his through the most solemn and dignified ceremony civilized man had devised. What the young women of his past demanded was none too good for her. Again, the girl voiced her question. "You wish to go?" "Yes, Nadara," he replied. "I must go back to my own people, and you must go with me." Her face lighted with happiness, but then doubt and fear returned. "I am afraid," she said. "But if you wish it, I will go. You need not fear, Nadara. None will harm you while Thander is with you. Come, let us return to the sea and the yacht before she sails." Hand in hand they retraced their steps down the steep cliff, across the little valley toward the forest and the sea. Nadara walked very close to Thander, her hand snuggled in his, her shoulder pressed tightly against his side. She was afraid of the new life among the strange creatures of civilization. At the far side of the valley, before the forest, grew a thick jungle of bamboreili, a narrow strip, 100 feet through at its greatest width. So dense was it that no creature could be seen a few feet within its gloomy avenues. Into this the two plunged, Thander in the lead, Nadara close behind. stepping in his footprints in involuntary concession to old training. There was no need here of deceiving a pursuer or seeking easier footing. The trail was smooth beaten by many a padded paw. It wound erratically forked, and other trails entered or crossed it. The 100 feet seemed far longer by the path. The two had nearly reached the forest side of the jungle when a sharp turn brought Thander face to face with a huge, bear-like man. The fellow wore a hide geist string, and a filthy leopard skin dangled from one shoulder. Otherwise, he was naked. His coarse hair was matted low over his forehead, the rest of his face covered by a bushy red beard. At sight of Thander, his little eyes burned with rage, and from his thick lips burst a savage yowl. It was the preliminary challenge. Ordinarily, coarse insults must pass between strangers on this inhospitable isle before they fly at one another's throat. "I am Thurg," bellowed the brute. "I can kill you," followed by vulgar allusions. "The bad men," whispered Nadera. Memory swept over Thander, the night a year before, when, though terrified, he had turned to battle a caveman that Nadera might escape. He glanced at the foe's crooked right forearm and smiled. The arm was bent from the knitting of a broken bone, poorly set. "You would kill Thander again?" he asked tauntingly, pointing to the deformed limb. Recognition came to Thurg's eyes, and with a ferocious bellow he charged. Thander met the charge with his pointed stick of hard-wooded sword. It entered the fleshy part of Thurg's breast, bringing a howl of pain and a trickle of crimson. Thurg retreated, scandalized. This was no way to fight. For several minutes he stood glaring, screaming hideous threats and insults. Then, with another roar, he charged again. Again the painful point entered his body. But this time he pressed in, clutching madly at the goad and for a hold upon Thander's body. The latter held Thurg at arm's length, prodding him with the fire-hardened point of his wooden sword. The caveman's little brain wondered at the skill and prowess of this stranger who had struck him a single blow with a cudgel many moons before, and then run like a rabbit to escape his wrath. Why was it that he did not run now? What strange change had taken place in him? He had expected an easy victim when he recognized his foe. But instead he had met with brawn and ferocity equal to his own, and with a strange weapon he had never before seen. Thander was puncturing him rapidly now, and Thurg was screaming in rage and suffering. Presently he could endure it no longer. With a sudden wrench he tore himself loose and ran, bellowing, through the jungle. Thander did not pursue. Was enough that he had rid himself of his enemy. He turned toward Nadara smiling. "It will seem very tame in Boston," he said. But though she smiled, she did not understand. For to her Boston was but another land of primeval forests and dense jungles, of hairy, battling men and fierce beasts. At the edge of the forest they came again upon Thurg, but this time he was surrounded by a score of burly tribesmen. Thander knew better than to pit himself against so many. Thurg came rushing down upon them, his fellows at his heels. In loud tones he screamed anew his challenge, and the beasts behind him took it up until the forest echoed. He had seen Nadara as he had battled with Thander, and recognized her as the girl he had desired a year before, the girl whom this stranger had robbed him of. Now he was determined to wreak vengeance and at the same time recapture the girl. Thander and Nadara turned back into the jungle, where but a single enemy could attack them at a time in the narrow trails. Here they eluded pursuit for several hours, coming again into the forest nearly a mile below the beach. The Priscilla had lain at anchor there. Thurg and his fellows had apparently given up the chase. They had neither seen nor heard aught of them for some time. Now the two hastened back through the wood to reach a point opposite the yacht. At last they came in sight of the harbor. Thander halted. A look of horror and disappointment supplanted the expression of anticipation that had lighted his countenance. The yacht was not there. A mile out they discerned her, steaming rapidly north. Thander ran to the beach. He tore the Black Panther's hide from his shoulders, waving it frantically above his head, shouting in futile endeavor to attract attention from the dwindling craft. Then, quite suddenly, he collapsed upon the beach, burying his face in his hands. Presently Nadara crept close to his side. Her soft arms encircled his shoulders as she drew his cheek close to hers in an attempt to comfort him. "Is it so terrible," she asked, "to be left here alone with your "It is not that," he answered. "If you were mine, I should not care so much. But you cannot be mine until we have reached civilization and you have been made mine in accordance. with the laws and customs of civilized men. And now who knows when another ship may come, if ever another will come. But I am yours, Thander, insisted the girl. You are my man, you have told me that you love me, and I have replied that I would be your mate. Who can give us to each other better than we can give ourselves? He tried, as best he could, to explain to her the marriage customs and ceremonies of his own world, but she found it difficult to understand how it might be that a stranger whom neither might ever have seen before could make it right for her to love her Thander, or that it should be wrong for her to love him without the stranger's permission. To Thander, the future looked most black and hopeless. With his sudden determination to take Nadara back to his own people, he had been overwhelmed with a mad yearning for home. He realized that his past apathy to the idea of returning to Boston had been due solely to recollection of Boston, as he had known it Boston without Nadara. But now that she was to have gone back with him, Boston seemed the most desirable spot. As he sat pondering the unfortunate happenings that had so delayed them that the yacht had sailed before they reached the shore, he also cast about for some plan to mitigate their disappointment. To live forever upon this savage island did not seem so appalling as it had a year before. But then he had not realized his love for the wild young creature at his side. If she could but be made his wife, then his exile here would be a happy rather than a doleful lot. What if he had been born here too? With the thought came a fresh idea. Had he, too, been native born, how would he have wed Nadara? Why, through the ceremony of their own people, of course. And if men and women were thus wed here, what more sacred a union could civilization offer? He sprang to his feet. Come, Nadara, he cried. We shall return to your people, and there you shall become my wife. Nadara was puzzled, but made no comment. She left the future to her lord and master. The return to the dwellings of Nadara's people occupied 3 never-to-be-forgotten days. How different this journey by comparison with that of a year since, when the cave girl had led the terror-stricken Waldo in flight. Then the forest glades echoed 2 pads of fierce beasts, and the stealthy passage of naked human horrors. No twig snapped that did not portend instant and terrifying death. Now Korth and Flatfoot were dead by Waldo's hand. The racking cough was gone. He had encountered bad men and come away with honors. Even Nagula, the sleek black devil cat of the hideous nights, no longer sent the slightest tremor through his rehabilitated nerves. Did not Thander wear Nagula's pelt about his shoulder, and Lowen's pelt taken in hand-to-hand encounter with the dread beast? Slowly they walked beneath giant trees, beside pleasant streams, and across open valleys with perfumed wildflowers. At night they slept where night found them, sometimes in a deserted lair of a wild beast, or perched among branches where rude platforms could be made. Thander cared that Nadara's couch be of the softest grasses, his near to protect her. Again Nadara was puzzled, but she made no comment. Finally they came to her village. Several younger men came forth to meet them, but when they saw he had slain Korth, they bridled their truculence. All but one Big Fist, who had assumed the role of king since Flatfoot had left. I can kill you, he announced by way of greeting, for I am Big Fist, and until Flatfoot returns, I am King Yand. Maybe afterward, for someday I shall kill Flatfoot. I do not wish to fight you, replied Thander. Already have I killed Korth, and Flatfoot will return no more. For Flatfoot I have killed also, and I can kill Big Fist, but what is the use? Why should we fight? Let us be friends, for we must live together. And if we do not kill one another, there will be more of us to meet the bad men, should they come, and kill them. When Big Fist heard that Flatfoot was dead, and by the hand of this stranger, he pined less to measure his strength with that of the newcomer. He saw the knothole that the other offered, and promptly he sought to crawl through it, but with honor. Very well, he said. I shall not kill you. You need not be afraid. But you must know that I am king, and do as I say that you shall do. Afraid, Thander laughed. You may be king, he said, but as for doing what you say, and again he laughed. It was a very different Waldo Emerson Smith Jones from the thing that the sea had spewed up 12 months before. The first thing that Thander did after he entered the village was to seek out Nadara's father. They found the old man in the poorest and least protected cave in the cliffside, exposed to danger. He was sick, and there was none to care for him, but he did not complain. That was the way of his people. When a man became too old to be of service, it were better that he died. so they did nothing to delay the inevitable. When one became an absolute burden upon his fellows, it was customary to hasten the end. Heavy rock quickly relieved both community and sufferer. Thander and Nadara came in and sat down beside him. The old fellow seemed glad to see them. "I am Thander," said the young man. "I wish to take your daughter as my mate." The old man looked at him questioningly for a moment. "You have killed Korth and Flatfoot. Who is to prevent you from taking Nadara?" Thander said, "I wish your permission in marriage ceremony." The old man shook his head. "I do not understand. There are fine caves not occupied. Slay or drive out their owners if you wish. They will yield to the slayer of Korth and Flatfoot." "I am not worried about a cave," said Thander. "Tell me how men take their wives among you." Nadara's father replied, "If they do not come willingly, we take them by the hair and drag them." "My mate would not come," he continued, "and even after I dragged her, she broke away and fled. But I caught her again, and this time I beat her until she slept. When she awoke, it was night. She was in my cave, and she did not run away anymore." For a long time, Thander sat in thought. Then he spoke, addressing Nadara. "In my country, we do not take wives in such a way, nor shall I take you thus. We must be married properly, according to the laws of civilization." Nadara made no reply. To her it seemed Thander cared little for her, and it made her sad. She thought other women would laugh at her. Surely they would see Thander did not want her. The old man heard the conversation. At last he spoke very feebly now, for he was near dissolution. "I am a very old man," he said. "I have not long to live. Before I die, I should like to know. Nadara has a mate who will protect her. I love her." Though he hesitated. "Though what?" asked Thander. "I have never told," whispered the old fellow. "My mate would not let me, but now that I am about to die, it can do no harm. Nadara is not my daughter." The girl sprang to her feet in shock. "Not your daughter? Then who am I?" she cried. "I do not know who you are, except that you are not even of my people. All that I know I will tell you now before I die. Come close, for my voice is dying faster than my body." The young man and the girl came nearer to his side, and squatting there, leaned close that they might catch each faintly articulated syllable. The old man began his story slowly, with effort. "My mate and I," he said, "were childless, though many moons had passed since I took her to my cave. She wanted a little one, for thus only may women have aught upon which to lavish their love. We had been hunting together for several days alone and far from the village. For I was a great hunter when I was young, no greater ever lived among our people. And one day we came down to the great water. There we saw a strange thing that floated upon the surface, and when it was blown closer, we saw it was hollow, and that in it were two people, man and a woman. Both appeared to be dead. Finally, I waded out to meet the thing, dragging it to shore, and there, sure enough, was a man and a woman. The man was dead, quite dead, long dead perhaps, but the woman was not dead. She was very fair, though her eyes and hair were black. We carried her ashore, and that night a little girl was born to her. But the woman died before morning, leaving only the child behind. We put her back into the strange thing that had brought her, she and the dead man who had come with her. Hand shoved them off upon the great water, where the breeze and tide carried them away. Before we sent them off, my mate took from the woman her strange coverings and a little bag of skin, which contained many sparkling stones and yellow and white metals, shaped into strange objects. It was evident she came from a strange land, for she and all her belongings were unlike anything we had ever seen. She was different, as Nadara is different. Nadara looks as her mother looked, for Nadara is the little babe born that night. We brought her back after another moon, saying she was born to my mate. But there was one woman who knew better, for she had seen us with the boat. My mate did not want anyone to say Nadara was not hers, for it is a great disgrace to be barren. She nearly killed that woman many times to keep her from telling the truth to the whole village. But I love Nadara as though she had been my own, and so I should like to see her well mated before I die." Thander had gone white during the narration, scarcely able to hide his emotion. He could barely restrain an impulse to fall to his knees and thank God that he had clung to civilized training rather than the primitive way. Providence, he thought, must indeed have sent him to rescue her. The old man, turning upon his rough palate, fastened his sunken eyes questioningly upon Thander. "Nadara too?" with parted lips, waited for him to speak. A strange rattling sound rose in his throat. Thander leaned above him, raising his head and shoulders slightly. The young man never had heard that sound before, but he needed no interpreter. The dread death rattle was unmistakable in its warning. Thander knew that it was the end. He saw the old man's mighty effort to push back the grim reaper, that he might speak once more. And the dying eyes were a question and a plea he understood well. He reached forward and took Nadara's hand. "In my own land we shall be mated," he said. "None other shall wed with Nadara, and as proof she is Thander's, she shall wear this always," slipping her a ring. The old man saw a look of relief and contentment, almost a smile, settled upon his features as, with a gasping sigh, he sank limply into Thander's arms, dead at last and freed of all suffering. That afternoon, several younger men carried the body to the cliff top, half a mile from the caves. There was no ceremony, only the first crude human funeral cortege, simple, sensible, and utilitarian. Acting under Big Fist's orders, they left the husk at a safe distance, to be swiftly disintegrated by beasts and birds of prey. Nadara wept silently, her grief pure, unlike the others around her. An elderly lady with a single tooth moaned in sympathy. Others joined her, until their hysteria turned into shrieks and screams. Soon the air was filled with hideous chorus, wild and unrestrained. Big Fist and the men, annoyed, rushed upon the mourners, scattering them with fists and teeth. Thus ended the strange festivities, or would have, had Big Fist not struck the fatal blow at Nadara. Thander had stood nearby, watching in wonder. He had noted Nadara's quiet grief reel and deep-panned the others' noisy hysteria. He understood why the men would silence such fiendish, nerve-shaking din. The female half-brutes were theirs, and Waldo Emerson had reverted enough to the primitive to feel no need to interfere. But Nadara was not theirs, and even had she not belonged to him, he would protect her. That she did belong to him, however, filled him with hot bloodlust rage as he sprang to intercept Big Fist's rush. Thander knew nothing of boxing or self-defense. His battles were still raw and primeval. Except for his crude weapons, he fought like his anthropoid progenitors, often forgetting them when he crouched to meet a charge. Now he sprang for Big Fist's hairy throat, their bodies colliding with a sullen thud. Rolling, biting, and tearing, they struggled on the rocky ground at the cliff base. The other men stopped their assault on the women, who ceased their shrieks, circling to watch the furious combat in silence. Nadara pushed forward, clutching a jagged rock. Big Fist was burly and mountainous, but Thander, muscled like Nagula, moved with panthering grace. A sudden blow bent Big Fist's thick neck, making him shriek in pain. Delighted by the effect, Thander struck again. Bellowing, Big Fist lunged desperately, closing with his foe. His teeth sought Thander's throat, but in so doing he exposed his own jugular to deadly retaliation. The strong white teeth of Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones sank into it, instinctive as if ages of evolution had not intervened. In an instant, the veneer of eons fell away, revealing the naked primitive brute again. Big Fist, white with terror, struggled to free himself. Thander's jaws tightened. A rush of spurting blood choked him. Big Fist convulsed, eyes rolling upward, then collapsed lifeless as the crimson torrent ebbed. Thander, drenched in blood, rose to his feet. Facing the ring of stunned spectators, he singled out for burly men. "Bear Big Fist to the cliff top," he commanded. "When you return, we shall choose a king." They obeyed at once, not grasping what he meant by choosing. To them, slaying was proof of kingship, and since all had seen him kill Korth Flatfoot, and now Big Fist, none dared challenge his right to reign. When they had come back to the village, Thander gathered them beneath a great tree that grew close to the base of the cliff. Here they squatted upon their haunches in a rough circle. Behind them stood the women and children, wide-eyed and curious. "Let us choose a king," said Thander when all had come. There was a long silence. Then one of the older men spoke. "I am an old man. I have seen many kings. They come by killing. They go by killing. Thander has killed 2 kings. Now he is king. Who wishes to kill Thander and become king?" There was no answer. The old man arose. "It was foolish to come here to choose a king," he said, "when a king we already have." "Wait," commanded Thander. Let us choose a king properly. Because I have killed Flatfoot and Big Fist does not prove that I can make a good king. Was Flatfoot a good king? He was a bad man, replied the Ancient One. Has a good man ever been king? Asked Thander. The old fellow puckered his brow in thought. Not for a long time, he said. That is because you always permit a bully and a brute to rule you, said Thander. That is not the proper way to choose a king. Rather, you should come together as we are come, and among you talk over the needs of the tribe, and when you are decided as to what measures are best for the welfare of the members of the tribe, then should you select the man best fitted to carry out your plans. That is a better way to choose a king. The old man laughed. And then, he said, would come a Big Fist or a Flatfoot, and slay our king, that he might be king in his place. Have you ever seen a man who could slay all the other men of the tribe at the same time? The old man looked puzzled. That is my answer to your argument, said Thander. Those who choose the king can protect him from his enemies. So long as he is a good king, they should do so. But when he becomes a bad king, they can then select another. Thander explained to the listening men. And if the bad king refuses to obey the new, it would be an easy matter for several men to kill him or drive him away. No matter how mighty a fighter he might be, he added clearly. Several of the men nodded understandingly. We had not thought of that, they said. Thander is indeed wise, the assembly murmured. The idea of protecting a chosen leader began to take root. So now, continued the American, let us choose a king whom the majority of us want. And then so long as he is a good king, the majority of us must fight for him and protect him. Let us choose a man whom we know to be a good man regardless of his ability to kill his fellows. For if he has the majority of the tribe to fight for him, what need will he have to fight for himself? What we want is a wise man, one who can lead the tribe to fertile lands and good hunting, and in times of battle, direct the fighting intelligently. Flatfoot and Big Fist had not brains enough between them. Such should not be the business of kings. Your king should protect your mates from such as Flatfoot, and he should punish those who would steal them. But how may he do these things? Asked a young man. If he is not the best fighter in the tribe. Have I not shown you how? Asked Thander. We who make him king shall be his fighters. He will not need to fight with his own hands. Again there was a long silence. Then the old man spoke. There is wisdom in the talk of Thander. Let us choose a king who must be good to us. If he wishes to remain king, it is bad for us to have a king whom we fear. I, for one, said the young man, do not care to be ruled unless he is able to defeat me in battle. If I can defeat him, then I should be king. And so they took sides. But at last they compromised by selecting one whom they knew to be wise, and a great fighter as well. Thus they chose Thander king. Once each week, said the new king, we shall gather here and talk among ourselves of the things which are for the best good of the tribe. And what seems best to the majority shall be done. The tribe will tell the king what to do. The king will carry out the work. And all must fight when the king says fight. And all must work when the king says work. Thander declared solemnly. For we shall all be fighting or working for the whole tribe. And I, Thander, your king, shall fight and work the hardest of you all. It was a new idea to them, strange and unheard of. It placed kingship in a totally different light from any by which they had previously viewed it. Thander knew it would take a long time for them to absorb the idea, yet he was glad of this start. In the meantime, they had a king who could command their respect according to the old standards, and he smiled when he thought of the change that had come since first he had trembled on that lonely shore. Waldo Emerson Smith Jones had gladly embraced the chance to assume kingship of the little tribe of troglodytes. First, because it assured Nadara's safety, and second, because it gave him scope for action. Where before he shrank from responsibility, now he longed to assume it. He wished to do, where once he had been content only to read of the accomplishments of others in books and lectures. Yet he soon discovered his classical education, guided by a fond, cultured mother, was a poor foundation for practical schemes. He wished to teach carpentry, but Ovid had offered no useful hints. His people lived by hunting rodents, robbing nests, and gathering fruit. Thander dreamed of community farming, but the cyclic poets gave him little help. He regretted Harvard, wishing for an agricultural school. Still, he resolved to do his best with the meager knowledge he held consisting mostly of the bare definition of agriculture. It was little, yet it implied possibilities of planting for human benefit. Thus, Thander stood a step ahead of his earliest progenitors, who had trusted wind and beasts to scatter seeds. He realized he occupied a strange place in the march of ages and knowledge. He had known modern life, wood and brick houses, glass windows, gas and electricity, and now, hurled back to the Stone Age, he found himself dissatisfied. He could not make brick, glass, or even fire. He could write verse in Greek, but he no longer prized that. He wished instead to tan hides or craft fire. His pride in scholarship shrank, leaving him feeling the most pitiful ignoramus alive. Criminally ignorant, he told Nadara. I wasted life on useless erudition, when I might have mastered practical knowledge to drag the world from barbarism. I could have added to mankind's welfare. I am no good. The girl touched his strong brown hand, pride in her eyes. To me you are wonderful, Thander. With your own hands you slew Nagula and Korth. Flatfoot and Big Fist are dead because of your might. Single-handed, you killed them all, 3 awesome men. No, my Thander is greater than all. Waldo Emerson could not resist pride as the girl he loved recounted his feats, once dismissed as vulgar prowess. The frail Waldo, who coughed and trembled at rustling leaves, was gone. In his place stood a great, full-blooded man, brown-skinned, steel-thewed, fearless, self-reliant, almost brutal in his pride of power. The months that passed as Thander led his people from one honeycombed cliff to another in search of a permanent village were filled with happiness for Nadara and her king, though alloyed with doubt. The girl's unease came from Thander's failure to claim her. She could not understand the ethics that kept them apart. He explained they must wait for his world's rites and ceremonies of marriage. Will this marriage ceremony make you love me more? Nadara asked. Thander laughed, taking her in his arms. I could not love you more, he replied. Then of what good is it? She pressed. It is difficult to explain, he said. You must be satisfied to know it is because I love you that we must wait. Nadara shook her head. My people take their mates as they will and are satisfied. But their king, who may mate as he chooses, waits until a man across the great water, whom he does not know, gives him permission to mate with one who loves him. Her tone lingered on, says. Someday, Thander said, when we reach my world, you will know I was right, and you will thank me. Until then, you must trust me. Half to himself, he added, God knows I have earned it. Nadara pretended to be content, but in her heart she still feared he did not truly love her. The veiled comments of the women worsened her doubts and offered her little peace of mind. All the while Thander taught her his language. He dreamed of taking her home and wished her ready for Boston and civilization. His plan was to find a place near the sea to watch for ships. At last he found such a place, a level meadow upon a low plateau overlooking the ocean. The soil was rich and black, timber lay on one side, and soft limestone cliffs rose on the other. Thander planned to build a village of logs against the cliff, burrowing inward for more rooms. The caves alone gave shelter, but he wanted his people to construct log dwellings to foster pride. If each family felt ownership, it would be harder for them to abandon homes as before, when moving to another cliff meant finding caves just as easily. This time, permanence would be rooted in effort. In other words, he hoped to give them a word their tongue had never known, home. Yet whether he would succeed, we may never know, for fate stepped in to shatter his plans with a single stroke. That afternoon, returning full of hope, Thander was followed by a burly, hairy figure creeping in his wake. Nadara, watching for him near the cliffs, ran forward joyfully to meet her lord. The creature halted at the brush's edge, his close-set eyes fixed on Nadara, lips trembling with desire, lids narrowing with cunning. He watched them walk arm in arm, then melted back into the thicket. That evening, Thander gathered the tribe by a great fire at the cliff's base. With Nadara beside him, he explained in detail the future he envisioned and the new order that would guide their lives. Some of the elders shook their heads, wary of change, yet most welcomed his plan of comfort and permanence. Thander wondered if their eagerness would endure when the labors of building truly began. He laid down new laws. Men must craft weapons and build houses. Women sharpen tools, cook, sew, and keep order. Men plowed the soil, women sowed seeds, all together harvested and stored the crops. Men hunted and fought, but only against enemies of the tribe. One who killed a tribesman without cause would suffer death. Other laws he made were plain and just, and even these people saw the good. Late that night, each crept to his poor cave, dreaming of airy rooms of logs, of plentiful food, and of safety from raids. Last of all remained Thander and Nadara. Seated upon a ledge in the moonlight, they spoke softly of the future. Thander's mind was filled with plans for his people, with dreams of bridging in 10 years the gulf that had cost mankind countless ages to span through struggle. "And you plan 10 years ahead?" Nadara asked gently, "when only yesterday you hoped a ship would bear us away to your world. Must we wait so long, Thander, before leaving this savage shore?" "I am planning for them," he answered. "We may not stay to see it, but I must set them on the road. When we go, I'll leave a king to carry out my work." Still, what was that? A low rumbling muttered threateningly out of the west. Deep and ominous it sounded, yet so low that it failed to awaken any member of the sleeping tribe that lay scattered in the caves. Before either could speak again, there came a slight trembling of the earth beneath them, scarcely noticeable had it not been preceded by the distant grumbling from the bowels of the world itself. The two upon the moonlit ledge rose quickly to their feet, Nadara drawing close to Thander, while the man's strong arm went about her shoulders in silent, instinctive protection against the unknown. "The great Nagula," she whispered. "Again he seeks to escape." "What do you mean?" asked Thander. "It is an earthquake distant and quite harmless to us," he explained, smiling to calm her fear. "No, it is the great Nagula," insisted Nadara. "Long ago, when our fathers' fathers were unborn, he roamed the land devouring all men, beasts and birds alike. Nothing escaped his hunger. One day my people found him sleeping in a deep gorge between two mountains. They were mighty men then, and when they saw their enemy asleep, half went to one side and half to the other, and they pushed the two mountains over into the gorge upon the sleeping beast, imprisoning him there. It is all true, for my mother had it from her mother, who was told it by hers before her. Even to this day is heard the growling of the great Nagula in anger, and the earth shakes as he strives beneath to shake the mountains from him. Did you not hear his voice and feel the ground rock?" Thander laughed. "Well, we are safe then," he cried, "for with two mountains piled upon him he cannot escape." "Who knows?" Nadara asked. "He is huge as a small mountain himself. Someday, they say, he will escape, and then naught will pacify his rage until he has destroyed every living creature upon the land. Do not worry, little one," Thander said gently. "The great Nagula must grumble louder and struggle more fiercely before ever he may dislodge two mountains. Even now he is quiet again, so run to your cave, sweetheart, it is time for sleep." He stooped and kissed her as she turned to go. For a moment she clung to him. "I am afraid, Thander," she whispered. "Why? I do not know. I only know I am afraid, with a great fear." Early next morning, while several women and children were at the river drawing water, the rest of Thander's tribe was startled from slumber by piercing shrieks echoing from the forest path. Before the hairy men, led by smooth-skinned Thander, reached the cliff's base in their rush to aid, several women appeared, fleeing swiftly, their screams mingled with cries of, "The bad men! The bad men!" At their heels came Thurg and a score of vicious brutes, long-armed, hairy skulking monsters, nearer ape than man, with close-set eyes and retreating foreheads, driven by lust and cannibal hunger. Woe to any victim in their grip, for their primordial passions were unrestrained, their foul appetite for human flesh notorious. In past raids they met little resistance. Terrified cave dwellers fled to dizzy ledges. From above, stones and boulders were hurled down upon foes, yet the bad men always seized a few before retreat was gained. But this time was different, though Third, grinning, dreamed of a great feast. With the men slain, storming the cliff to carry off women and children would be easy. In his brutish mind gleamed the image of the brown beauty he had seen greeting the smooth-skinned stranger. That Thander's men might turn the tables never entered his dull brain. His half-brutes outmuscled cave dwellers, and only the strange, slim stranger troubled him. Though their odd weapons puzzled him more. Long slim sticks, little slivers in skin bags, curved branches strung with gut-what use. Were these toys? Soon he would know. For Thander's men advanced not in a mob, but in a disciplined line. Thander stood in the center, calling orders left and right. The ends of the line spread, flanking Thurk's charge. At 50 feet crouched for battle, the enemy bent their branches and let fly the slivers. A sudden chorus of twang. Thurg clutched his neck in pain. A sliver lodged just an inch from his jugular. With a howl, he ripped it free, as he saw his brutes pierced, 2 lying dead in the grass. The sight brought the beast man to a halt. He saw his fellows charging the foe. Saw another volley of slivers speed from bent branches. Down went another fighter, pierced by strange weapons. Then, at Thander's shouted command, the tribe cast aside boughs and seized their long slim sticks, rushing forward to meet Thurg's people. Thurg smiled grimly. Now, surely, it would soon be over. He turned toward his oncoming fit was Thander. Rage, revenge, lust for blood fired his brute brain. With huge paws he would tear the puny stick away and at last crush that smooth throat. But from the corner of his eye, he saw a strange sight, his people flying. Incredible, yet true. Growling in pain, they ran the gauntlet of fire-sharpened lances. 3 lay dead, the rest streaming blood. Enough for Thurg, he did not wait to clash with Thander. With a howl of dismay he wheeled and dashed for the woods. Last to pass the converging ends of Thander's primitive, victorious battle line. So fast he fled that Nadara, watching from the cliff, swore his feet flew higher than his head at each frantic leap. Thander's men pursued for a mile before returning, laughing, to the waiting tribe. It was a day of triumph. There was feasting, and Thander, recalling things he had read of savage races, improvised a dance in honor of victory, though he knew little of dances save their meaning. He knew song and dance marked a step upward in man's evolution. Yet he flushed at thought of his dignified parents, beholding him now, near naked, panther skin about his loins, leading a wild dance. He moved with leaps and bounds, then stately steps, clapping hands to mark the rhythm, while behind him a score of naked warriors mimicked his every antic, aping him in perfect, boisterous fidelity. Around them squatted the tribe, more absorbed by this first ceremonial than by any event in memory, clapping their hands in time. Nadara watched, lips parted, wide-eyed, her soul stirred deeply. Something long forgotten welled within her urging expression. Her feet ached to move, her heart swelled with unknown melodies. She only knew she was excited, happy, her spirit light as forest wind. Now the dance was done. Thander led the warriors back to the feast. In the open circle where Bodhis had leaped and swirled, Nadara ran, drawn by a subtle excitement of the soul beyond her knowing. Around her slim, graceful figure was draped the glossy black pelt of Nagula, another trophy of the prowess of her man. It half concealed but to accentuate the beauties of her form in the glow. With eyes half closed, she took a half-dozen graceful, tentative steps. Now the eyes of Thander and several others were upon her, but she did not see them. Suddenly, with outthrown arms, she commenced to dance. She bent her lithe body, swaying from side to side as she fell, with graceful abandon, into steps and poses that seemed as natural to her as repose, weaving simple yet intricate movements around the circle. Every eye was upon her, as every savage heart leaped in unison with her shapely feet, rising and falling in harmony with her lithe brown limbs. Of all the hearts that leaped, fastest leaped the heart of Thander, for he saw in the poetry of motion of the untutored girl the proof of her birthright, the truth of all that he had guessed. Since her foster father related the story of her birth upon his deathbed, none but a child of an age-old culture could possess this inherent talent. Any moment he expected her lips to break forth in song, nor was he disappointed, for soon Nadara lifted her voice in clear, bird-like notes. It was a wordless paean of love and life and happiness, rising as the circling cave folk clapped their palms in time to her steps. At last, exhausted, she paused, and her eyes fell upon Thander, breaking into merry laughter. "The king is not the only one who can leap and play upon his feet," she cried. Thander came to the center of the circle, and kneeling at her feet took one of her hands in his and kissed it warmly. "The king is only mortal and a man," he said. "It is no reproach that he cannot equal the divine grace of a goddess. You are very wonderful, my Nadara. From loving you, I am coming to worship you." And within the deep and silent wood, another was stirred by the sight of the half-naked girl. It was Thurg who had sneaked back alone to seek an opportunity for vengeance upon Thander and his people. Half-formed in his evil brain had been a certain plan, which the sight of Nadara, dancing in the firelight, had turned to concrete resolution. With the dancing and the feasting over, the tribe betook itself to the caves. They expected soon to desert the rocky caves for the more comfortable village to the east, beside the great water, under the direction of their king. At last all was still. The village slept in quiet slumber. No sentry guarded their slumbers, for Thander, steeped in book learning, had never yet known a cause for a night guard. Having defeated Thurg and his people, he thought they would not return, and certainly not by night, for the people of this wild island seldom roamed by night, having too much respect for the teeth and talons of Nagula to venture forth after darkness had settled upon the grim forests and the lonely plains. But a tempest of uncontrolled emotions surged through the hairy breast of Thurg. He forgot Nagula, thinking only of revenge, and the black-haired beauty who had so often eluded him. As he saw her dancing in the firelight, his desire became frenzy. He nearly rushed single-handed among foes to seize her, but caution prevailed. He waited impatiently until the last cave folk retired. He had seen where Nadara withdrew into a cave far up the cliff. Above Thander's the moon was overcast. The fire embers glowed, darkness veiled the land. In the wood, Nagula coughed and cried. The weird sound raised the coarse hair at Thurg's nape. Casting a backward glance, he crouched low and moved quickly across the clearing toward the cliff space, flattening against a boulder to listen. No sound broke the stillness of the village. None had seen his approach. Carefully he began climbing, made hard by removal of ladders withdrawn at night when the tribe retired to their caves. But Thurg had dragged a slim sapling from the forest. He leaned it against the cliff. Its end just topped the lowest ledge. Clumsy in appearance, he climbed silently with ape-like ease despite his bulk. Like a huge cat, he scrambled up, clutched the ledge, and squatted. He groped for the drawn-up ladder, set it to the next ledge. Thereafter the way was easy, steep trails having replaced old ladders. Thander's innovation made ascent simple. Thus Thurg came to Nadara's cave. Tempted to slay Thander as he passed, he restrained himself, though hating the smooth-skinned interloper with venom. Now he stooped, listening by the cave's entrance. He heard Nadara's steady breathing within. Hot blood surged his veins. His huge paws opened, closed. Breath sucked hot between his flabby lips. Just beneath him, Thander lay dreaming. He saw a vision of a nymph dancing in firelight, encircled by the Smith Joneses, Standishes, Livingston Browns, Quincy Adams Cootses, and Boston's aristocracy. It seemed no wonder to Thander that none had enough clothing to drape the Laocoon. His father wore a loincloth, while Mrs. John Alden Smith-Jones dressed in scant skins sewn with gut. As the nymph danced, the audience clapped in time. When she finished, they approached, crawling on hands and knees to kiss her hand. Suddenly Thander saw that the nymph was Nadara. He sprang forward to claim her, but a coarse, bearded man with slanted forehead and close-set eyes leaped from the crowd, seized Nadara and fled with her toward a waiting trolley car. He knew the man was Thurg, though incongruously dressed in evening clothes. Nadara screamed once, waking Thander. He raised on one elbow, looked toward the cave entrance, and sighed with relief. It had been only a dream. With the memory still lingering, he lay back again upon his bed of grasses, and soon Thander was wrapped in deep, dreamless slumber beneath the quiet night. Cautiously, Thurg crawled into the cave where Nadara slept upon her couch of soft grasses, wrapped in the glossy pelt of Nagula, the Black Panther. The hulking form of the beast-man blotted out the faint light that filtered from the lesser darkness of the night without, through the jagged entrance to the cave. All within was Stygian gloom. Groping with his hands, Thurg came at last upon a corner of the grassy pallet, worming inch by inch closer to the sleeper. Now his fingers felt the thick fur of the panther skin. Lightly, for so gross a thing, his touch followed her form until he felt the silky luxuriance of her raven hair. For an instant he paused. Then quickly and silently, one great palm clapped roughly over Nadara's mouth, while the other arm encircled her waist. Awakened and terrified, Nadara struggled to free herself and to scream. But the giant hand sealed her lips, while the arm about her waist held her firmly. Thurg spoke no word. But as Nadara's hands touched his hairy breast and matted beard, she guessed the identity of her abductor and shuddered in fear, assuring himself his hold was secure and no trailing end of her robe might trip him. Third commenced the descent down the cliff face with his prize. Opposite Thander's cave, Nadara struggled fiercely, striving to scream aloud. Thurg pressed his palm tighter, and soon they passed unnoticed to the ledge. Down the winding trail of the upper ledges, Thurg's task was easy thanks to Thander. But near the bottom, he was compelled to take the upper ladder. Here it was necessary to remove his hand from her mouth. With a low growl, he warned her to silence with threats of instant death, then swung onto the ladder. For an instant, Nadara was too paralyzed with terror to act. But just as Thurg set foot upon the ledge at the bottom of the ladder, she screamed aloud once. Instantly, Thurg's hand fell roughly across her lips. Brutally, he shook her, squeezing her body until she gasped for breath, fearing her ribs might snap. For a moment, Thurg stood silently upon the ledge, compressing the tortured body of his victim and listening intently for signs of pursuit from above. Presently, Nadara's agony overcame her. She swooned. Thurg felt her form relax, and his flabby lips twisted to a hideous grin of triumph and desire. The cliff was quiet. The scream had not disturbed her tribesmen. Thurg swung the ladder below, and soon stood at the bottom with his unconscious burden. Without noise, he removed the ladder and sapling he had used, laying them on the ground. This would halt pursuit until others brought fresh ladders down. But no pursuit came. Thurg disappeared into the dark forest with his prize, carrying her far, pig eyes straining for any sign of savage beast near. The half-atrophied muscles of his little ears, still responding to a nearly dead instinct, strove to prick forward at the crackling of leaves beneath fanged paws. But the woods seemed lifeless. No creature appeared to thwart the beastman's evil purpose. Far behind, Thander slept, unaware. Thurg grinned, moving forward under the moon's silver-green light breaking through clouds. Nadara awoke from her swoon in a little open glade. Instantly she recalled what had happened before her unconsciousness. In the moonlight, she recognized Thurg smirking horribly down at her face. Thander had often spoken to her of religion, teaching her of his god. She now thanked him that Thurg was too low in evolution to know kissing. The thought of his lips made her shudder. Thurg lowered her to her feet, clutching her shoulder. His greedy, bloodshot eyes devoured her, his awful lips trembling as hot breath came in excited gasps. She knew the end was near. Desperately, she sought escape. Thurg pulled her closer, but suddenly she struck him full in the mouth. Tearing herself free, she fled. Yet within moments he seized her, hurling her to ground. The blood from his wounded lips dropped upon her face and throat. Then from afar came a deep, thunderous rumble. Thurg raised his head, listening. Again and again came that dreadful sound. "The great Nagula is coming to punish you," whispered Nadara. Thurg squatted beside her, his passion checked by fear. The ground trembled, shook violently, then tossed as roaring grew deafening. Frozen with terror, Thurg rose to his feet. A lull came, then another shock more terrible. The earth rose and fell, fissures gaping wide, swallowing trees, then closing like hungry mouths denied food. Thurg was thrown down. Terror-stricken, he screamed. Another lull came, and now the beastman leaped up and dashed into the forest. Nadara was left alone in the moonlit, trembling glade. The earth quaked again. The voice of great Nagula rumbled across the world. Animals fled past Nadara, terrified deer, foxes, squirrels, countless rodents scattering in wild, desperate panic. A black panther and his mate trotted shoulder to shoulder into the glade. They eyed Nadara briefly, then loped silently into the brush. Directly behind them came 3 deer in flight. Nadara felt no fear of the panthers, unlike ordinary times. Even deer ran with their natural foes. All lesser fears vanished, swallowed by the overwhelming terror of the great earthquake. Dawn broke in the east. Rumblings diminished. Tremors came at greater intervals with lessening violence. Nadara began retracing her steps toward the village, still hoping Thander would come. But at the forest's edge, no sign of Thander or her tribesmen appeared. At last she stepped into the open. Before her rose the cliff, and anguish broke from her lips. Torn, tortured, crumpled, were the lofty crags that had been her home, the home of Thander's tribe. The cliff top had broken away, lying in a jagged heap at the foot below. The caves had vanished, Ledges crumbled before the titanic struggles of the great Nagula. All was desolation and ruin. Nadara approached closer, horror filling her heart at the devastation. Among the shattered rocks were wedged, crushed, mangled forms of men, women, and children. The tribe was destroyed, their homes gone, their lives broken beneath the fury of Earth's wrath. Tears coursed down Nadara's cheeks. Sobs racked her slender figure. And Thander, where was he? Desperately she climbed over the debris, searching where his cave might once have stood. But there was nothing, only blank, silent stone. She tore frantically at sharp rocks, her fingers cut and bleeding, calling his name aloud. No answer came from the lifeless cliff. Late in the afternoon, weak and exhausted, she gave up. That night she slept in a crevice between two boulders. At dawn, she resolved to find a cave where she could live alone. For a week she wandered. Most caves she had known were demolished by the quake. At last she found the cliff Thander had chosen. Here, the destruction seemed far less severe. High on the cliff's face, she discovered a safe cavern. A slender sapling ladder gave access, drawn up after her to Barnagula or wandering men from reaching the entrance. She carried rocks to the ledge to hurl at intruders. Fruits, nuts, vegetables, and a gourd of water she stored inside. Resting on the ledge, she gazed across the plain and sea. Something stirred in the tree's shadow far below. Was it a man? Alarmed, Nadara pulled her sapling ladder up beside her, heart thudding as she peered anxiously into the distance. At daybreak, Thurg, fleeing Nagula's wrath, returned to his tribe's camp, but found only a great fissure where they had been. It seemed the earth had swallowed them all in one bite. He searched in vain for his people, then turned back into the forest to hunt Nadara. At the ruined cliff he found her footprints, her grassy bed, and signs of her desperate search. Diligently he tracked her spoor eastward for days. At last he reached a plain by the sea. There, across the open ground, he saw lofty cliffs and someone clambering toward a cave. Peering intently, his eyes narrowed. Yes, it was a woman, it was Nadara. With a whoop of exultation, Thurg burst from the forest, running straight toward the cliff where she crouched. Beside her pile of jagged missiles, Nadara braced herself, heart pounding, to battle once more with the hideous brute, for more than life itself was at stake in that desperate moment. A year had passed since Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones left his Back Bay home, seeking in a long sea voyage a cure for his cough and hectic cheeks that proclaimed his near incurable condition. 2 months later came the first press notice. The steamer he sailed on had narrowly escaped destruction by a tidal wave. The dispatch reported crew lost, an officer, and 1 passenger. The passenger was Waldo E. Smith-Jones, son of John Alden Smith-Jones of Boston. Though the ship circled back, no trace of survivors was seen. Fear of another wave drove them off. Mrs. Smith-Jones was prostrated. At once, John Alden Smith-Jones fitted out his yacht Priscilla under Captain Burlingham, an old friend, to search the distant coast for his son's body. Now Burlingham had returned to report failure. Sitting in the library, he said they had patrolled miles of sand, found 1 sailor's body, but nothing resembling Waldo along the entire coast. They ventured inland, meeting fierce white savages who hurled rocks and fled from gunfire. On the east coast, Burlingham found a bag of jewels Nadara had left, and told their tragic story. Mrs. Smith-Jones recalled entertaining the Count and Countess of Cressy. Silence fell. Perhaps it was mercy they found no bones. Still, despair weighed heavy on the grieving parents' hearts. A bell rang. The houseman brought a special delivery letter. Mr. Smith-Jones cut it open. "My God," he cried. "He is alive. Waldo is alive." Burlingham and Mrs. Smith-Jones sprang up. The letter, from Captain Dobbs, of the Sally Corwith, said they found Waldo on an island at 10 South 150 West. He refused to leave, asked only for a razor and tobacco. Enclosed was Waldo's own letter. He was well, his cough gone, robust, surrounded by interesting people. He promised to return soon after fulfilling obligations to his newfound companions. Mrs. Smith-Jones wept with joy. He is alive and well, surrounded by interesting people. Lonely the refined could interest my Waldo. Burlingham, recalling Harry Manbroots, politely held his tongue. John Alden resolved to sail again. Within a week, the Priscilla departed Boston, Burlingham, in command, Stark as first officer, and Mrs. Smith-Jones herself determined to endure the voyage. They rounded the Horn and neared 10 South, 150 West. For weeks they scoured the coast, pressing inland, but found no civilized settlement. At last they anchored in Eugenie Bay. There Stark discovered a skeleton, squat and broad. "Not Waldo," said Burlingham. "A gorilla or low type of man." Mr. Smith-Jones shuddered. What an awful creature. Imagine Waldo facing that. As they pondered, a sailor shouted. All eyes turned to the cliffs. A woman ran fleetly toward them, pursued by a thick-set brute. She scrambled upward, clinging to a sapling ladder. The brute seized the sapling's base, dragging it. In another moment she would fall. Burlingham and Stark raised rifles. 2 shots cracked together, echoing through the valley as the scene froze. Upon the day that Thurg discovered Nadera, he had come racing to the foot of the cliff, roaring and bellowing like a mad bull. Upward he clambered half the distance to the girl's lofty perch. Then a bit of jagged rock, well aimed, had brought him to a sudden halt, spitting blood and teeth from his injured mouth. He looked up at Nadara and shrieked out his rage and his threats of vengeance. Nadara launched another missile at him that caught him full upon one eye, dropping him like a stone to the narrow ledge upon which he had been standing. Quickly the girl started to descend to his side to finish the work she had commenced, for she knew that there could be no peace or safety for her, now that Thurg had discovered her hiding place, while the monster lived. But she had scarce more than lowered her sapling to the ledge beneath her when the giant form of the man moved and Thurg sat up. Quickly Nadara clambered back to her ledge, again drawing her sapling after her. She was about to hurl another missile at the man when he spoke to her. "We are alone in the world," he said. "All your people and all my people have been slain by the great Nagula. Come down. Let us live together in peace. There is no other left in all the world." Nadara laughed at him. "Come down to you," she cried mockingly. "Live with you. I would rather live with the pigs that root in the forest. Go away, or I will finish what I have commenced, and kill you. I would not live with you, though I knew that you were the last human being on earth." Thurg pleaded and threatened, but all to no avail. Again he tried to clamber to her side, but again he was repulsed with well-aimed missiles. At last he withdrew, growling and threatening. For weeks he haunted the vicinity of the cliff. Nadara's meager food supply was soon exhausted. She was forced to descend to replenish her larder and fill her gourd, or die of starvation and thirst. She made her trips to the forest at night, though Black Nagula prowled and the menace of Thurg loomed through the darkness. At last the man discovered her in one of these nocturnal expeditions, and almost caught her before she reached her ledge of safety. For 3 days he kept her a close prisoner. Again her stock of provisions was exhausted. She was desperate. Twice had Nagula nearly trapped her in the forest. She dared not again tempt fate. In the gloomy wood by night, there was nothing left but to risk all in one last effort to elude Thurg by day, and find another asylum in some far distant corner of the island. Carefully she watched her opportunity, and while the beast man was temporarily absent, seeking food for himself, the girl slid swiftly to the base of the cliff and started through the tall grasses for the opposite side of the valley. Upon this day, Thurg had fallen upon the spoor of deer as he had searched the forest for certain berries that were in season and which he particularly enjoyed. The trail led along the edge of the wood to the opposite side of the valley, and over the hills into the region beyond. All day Thurg followed the fleet animals, until at last, not having come up with them, he was forced to give up the pursuit and return to the cliffs, lest his more valuable quarry should escape. Halfway between the hills and the cliff, he came suddenly face to face with Nadara. Not 20 paces separated them. With a howl of satisfaction, Thurg leaped to seize her, but she turned and fled before he could lay his hand upon her. If Thurg had found his other quarry of that day swift, so too, he now found Nadara, for terror gave wings to her flying feet. Lumbering after her came Thurg, and had the distance been less, he would have been left far behind, but it was a long distance from the spot where they had met to Nadara's cliffs. The girl could outrun the man for a short distance, but when victory depended upon endurance, the advantage was all upon the side of the brute. As they neared the goal, Nadara realized that the lead she had gained at first was rapidly being overcome by the horrid creature panting so close behind her. She strained every nerve and muscle, in a last mad effort to distance the fate that was closing upon her. She reached the cliff. Thurg was just behind her. Half spent, she stumbled upward in what seemed to her pitiful slowness. At last her hand grasped the sapling that led to the mouth of her cave. In another instant she would be safe. But her newborn hope went out as she felt the sapling slipping and glanced downward to see Thurg dragging it from its position. She shut her eyes that she might not see the depths below, into which she was about to be hurled. And then there smote upon her ears the most horrific burst of sound that had ever assailed them, other than the thunders that rolled down out of the heavens when the rains came. But this sound did not come from above, it came from the valley beneath. The ladder ceased to slip. She opened her eyes and glanced downward. Far below her lay the body of Thurg. She could see that he was quite dead. He lay upon his face, and from his back trickled the tiny streams of blood. From little holes, Nadara clambered upward to her ledge, drawing her sapling after her. And then she looked about for an explanation of the strange noise and the sudden death of Thurg, for she could not but connect the one with the other. Below, in the valley, she saw a number of men strangely garbed. They were coming toward her cliff. She gathered her missiles closely about her, ready to her hand. Now they were below and calling up to her. Her eyes dilated in wonder. They spoke the strange tongue that Than had tried to teach her. She called down to them in her own tongue, but they shook their heads, motioning her to descend. She was afraid. All her life she had been afraid of men, and with reason of all, except her old foster father and Thander. These, evidently, were men. She could only expect from them the same treatment that Thurg would have accorded her. One of them had started up the face of the cliff. It was stark. Nadara seized a bit of rock and hurled it down upon him. He barely dodged the missile, but he desisted in his attempt to ascend to her. Now Burlingham advanced, raising his hand, palm toward her in sign that she should not assault him. She recalled some of the language that Thander had taught her. Maybe they would understand it. "Go away," she cried. "Go away, Nadara. Kill bad men." A look of pleasure overspread Burlingham's face. The girl spoke English. "We are not bad men," he called up to her. "We will not harm you. What you want?" asked Nadara, still unconvinced by mere words. "We want to talk with you," replied Burlingham. "We are looking for a friend who was shipwrecked upon this island. Come down. We will not harm you. Have we not already proved our friendship by killing this fellow who pursued you?" This man spoke precisely the tongue of Thander. Nadara could understand every word, for Thander had talked to her much in English. She could understand it better than she could speak it. If they talked the same tongue as Thander, they must be from the same country. Maybe they were Thander's friends. Anyway, they were like him, and Thander never harmed women. She could trust them. Slowly she lowered her sapling and began the descent. Several times she hesitated, as though minded to return to her ledge, but Burlingham's kindly voice and encouragement at last prevailed, and presently, Nadara stood before them. The officers and men of the Priscilla crowded around the girl. They were struck with her beauty, and the simple dignity of her manner and her carriage. The great black panther skin that fell from her left shoulder, she wore with the majesty of a queen, and with a naturalness that cast no reflection upon her modesty, though it revealed quite as much of her figure as it hid. William Stark, first officer of the Priscilla, caught his breath. Never, he was positive, had God made a more lovely creature. From the top of the cliff, a shaggy man peered down upon the strange scene. He blinked his little eyes, scratched his matted head, and once he picked up a large stone that lay near him. But he did not hurl it upon those below, for he had heard the loud report of the rifles, seen the smoke belch from the muzzles, and witnessed the sudden and miraculous collapse of Thurg. Burlingham was speaking to Nadara. "Who are you?" he asked. "Nadara," replied the girl. "Where do you live?" Nadara jerked her thumb over her shoulder, toward the cliff at her back. Burlingham searched the rocky escarpment with his eyes, but saw no sign of another living being there. "Where are your people?" "Dead, all of them." Nadara nodded affirmatively. "How long have they been dead, and what killed them?" continued Burlingham. "Almost a moon. The great Nagula killed them." In answer to other questions, Nadara related all that had transpired since the night of the earthquake. Her description of the catastrophe convinced the Americans that a violent quake had recently occurred to shake the island to its foundations. "Ask her about Waldo," whispered Mr. Smith-Jones, himself dreading to put the question. "We are looking for a young man," said Burlingham, "who was lost overboard from a steamer on the west coast of this island. We know that he reached the shore alive, for we have heard from him. Have you ever seen or heard of this stranger? His name is Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones. This gentleman is his father," indicating Mr. Smith-Jones. Nadara looked with wide eyes at John Alden Smith-Jones. So this man was Thander's father. She felt very sorry for him, for she knew that he loved Thander. Thander had often told her so. She did not know how to tell him. She shrank from causing another the anguish and misery that she had endured. "Did you know of him?" asked Burlingham. Nadara nodded her head. "Where is he?" cried Waldo's father. "Where are the people with whom he lived here?" Nadara came close to John Alden Smith-Jones. There was no fear in her innocent young heart for this man who was Thander's father, who loved Thander only, a great compassion for him and the sorrow that she was about to inflict. Gently she took his hand in hers, raising her sad eyes to his. "Where is he? Where is my boy?" whispered Mr. Smith. "He is with his people, who are my people, the people of whom I have just told you," replied Nadara softly. "He is dead." And then she dropped her face upon the man's hand and wept. The shock staggered John Alden Smith-Jones. It seemed incredibly impossible that Waldo could have lived through all that he must have lived through to perish at last, but a few short weeks before succor reached him. For a moment he forgot the girl. It was her hot tears upon his hand that aroused him to a consciousness of the present. "Why do you weep?" he cried almost roughly. "For you," she replied. "Who loved him too?" "You loved Waldo?" asked the boy's father. Nadara nodded her tumbled mass of raven hair. John Alden Smith-Jones looked down upon the bent head of the sobbing girl in silence for several minutes. Many things were racing through his patrician brain. He was by training, environment and heredity, narrow and puritanical. He saw the meager apparel of the girl, he saw her nut-brown skin, but he did not see her nakedness, for something in his heart told him that sweet virtue clothed her more effectually than could silks and satins without virtue. Gently he placed an arm about her, drawing her to him. "My daughter," he said, and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was a solemn and sorrow-ridden party that boarded the Priscilla. An hour later, Mrs. Smith-Jones had seen them coming. Some intuitive sense may have warned her of the sorrow that lay in store for her upon their return. At any rate, she did not meet them at the rail as in the past. Instead, she retired to her cabin to await her husband there. When he joined her, he brought with him a half-naked young woman. Mrs. Smith-Jones looked upon the girl with ill-concealed horror. Waldo's mother met the shock of her husband's news with much greater fortitude than he had expected. As a matter of fact, she had been prepared for this from the first. She had never really believed that Waldo could survive for any considerable time, far from the comforts and luxuries of his Boston home, and the watchful care of herself. "And who is the so person?" she asked coldly at last, holding her pince nez before her eyes, as with elevated brows, she cast a look of disapproval upon Nadara. The girl, reading more in the older woman's manner than her words, drew herself up proudly. Mr. Smith-Jones coughed and colored. He stepped to Nadara's side, placing his arm about her shoulders. "She loved Waldo," he said simply. "The brazen hussy," exclaimed Mrs. Smith-Jones. "To dare to love a Smith-Jones." Come, Louisa," ejaculated her husband. "Remember that she too is suffering. Do not add to her sorrow. She loved our boy, and he returned her love." "How do you know that?" "She has told me," replied the man. "It is not true," cried Mrs. Smith-Jones. "It is not true. Waldo Emerson would never stoop to love one out of his own high class." "Who is she? And what proof have you that Waldo loved her?" "I am Nadara," said the girl proudly, answering for herself, "and this is the proof that he loved me. He told me that this was the pledge token between us until we could come to his land and be mated according to the customs there." She held out her left hand, upon the third finger of which sparkled a great solitaire, which Mrs. John Alden Smith-Jones recognized instantly. "He gave you that?" she asked. Then she turned toward her husband. "What do you intend doing with this girl?" she asked. "I shall take her back home," replied he. She should be as a daughter to us, for Waldo would have made her such had he lived. She cannot remain upon the island. All her people were killed by the earthquake that destroyed Waldo. She is in constant danger of attack by wild beasts and wilder men. We cannot leave her here, and even if we could, I should not do so. For we owe a duty to our dead boy to care for her as he would have cared for her hand. We owe a greater duty to her. I must be alone, was all that Mrs. Smith-Jones replied. Please take her away, John. Give her the cabin next to this, and have Marie clothe her properly. Marie's clothes should about fit her. There was more of tired anguish in her voice now than of anger. Mr. Smith-Jones led Nadera out and summoned Marie, but Nadera upset his plans by announcing that she wished to return to shore. She does not like me, she said, nodding toward Mrs. Smith-Jones's cabin, and I will not stay. It took John Alden Smith-Jones a long time to persuade the girl to change her mind. He pointed out that his wife was greatly overwrought by the shock of the news of Waldo's death. He assured Nadara that at heart she was a kindly woman, and that eventually she would regret her attitude toward the girl. And at last, Nadara consented to remain aboard the Priscilla. But when Marie would have clothed her in the garments of civilization, she absolutely refused, scorning the hideous and uncomfortable clothing. It was 2 days before Mrs. Smith-Jones sent for her. When she entered that lady's cabin, the latter exclaimed at once against her barbarous attire. I gave instructions that Marie should dress you properly, she said. You are not decently clothed. That bearskin is shocking. Nadara tossed her head, and her eyes flashed fire. I shall never wear your silly clothes, she cried. This Thander gave me. He slew Nagula, the Black Panther, with his own hands, and gave the skin to me who was to be his mate. Do you think I would exchange it for such foolish garments as those? And she waved a contemptuous gesture toward Mrs. Smith-Jones's expensive morning gown. The elder woman forgot her outraged dignity in the suggestion the girl had given her for an excuse to be rid of her at the first opportunity. She had mentioned a party named Thamber. She had brazenly boasted that this Thamber had killed the beast whose pelt she wore and given her the thing for a garment. She had admitted that she was to become this person's mate. Mrs. Smith-Jones shuddered at the primitive word. At this moment, Mr. Smith-Jones entered the cabin. He smiled pleasantly at Nadar, and then, seeing in the attitudes of the two women that he had stepped within a theater of war, he looked questioningly at his wife. Now what, Louisa? He asked, somewhat sharply. Sufficient, John, exclaimed that lady, to bear out my original contention that it was a very unwise move to bring this woman with us. She has just admitted that she was the promised mate of a person she calls Thander. She is brazen. I refuse to permit her to enter my home, nor shall she remain upon the Priscilla longer than is necessary to land her at the first civilized port. Mr. Smith-Jones looked questioningly at Nadara. The girl had guessed the erroneous reasoning that had caused Mrs. Smith-Jones's excitement. She had forgotten that they did not know that Waldo and Thander were one. Now she could scarce repress a smile of amusement, nor resist the temptation to take advantage of Mrs. Smith-Jones's ignorance to bait her further. You had another lover beside Waldo? Asked Mr. Smith-Jones. I loved Thander, she replied. Thander was king of my people. He loved me. He slew Nagula for me and gave me his skin. He slew Korth and Flatfoot, also. They wanted me, but Thander slew them, and Big Fist he slew, and Sag the Killero. Thander was a mighty fighter. Can you wonder that I loved him? He was a hideous murderer, cried Mrs. Smith-Jones. And to think that my poor Waldo, poor, timid, gentle Waldo, was condemned to live among such savage brutes. Oh, it is too terrible. Nadara's eyes went wide. It was her turn to suffer a shock. Poor, timid, gentle Waldo. Had she heard aright? Could it be that they were describing the same man? There must be some mistake. Did Waldo know that you loved Thander? Asked Mr. Smith-Jones. Thander was Waldo, she replied. Thander is the name I gave him. It means the brave one. He was very brave, she cried. He was not timid, and he was only gentle with women and children. Mrs. Smith had never been so shocked in all her life. She sprang to her feet. Leave my cabin, she cried. I see through your shallow deception. You thoughtlessly betrayed yourself and your vulgar immoralities. And now you try to hide behind a base calumny that pictures my dear dead boy as one with your hideous, brutal chief. "You shall not deceive me longer. Leave my cabin, please." Mr. Smith-Jones stood as one paralyzed. He could not believe in the perfidy of the girl. It seemed impossible that she could have so deceived him. Nor yet could he question the integrity of his own ears. It was, of course, too far beyond the pale of reason to attempt to believe that Waldo Emerson and the terrible Thander were one and the same. The girl had gone too far, and yet he could not believe that she was bad. There must be some explanation. In the meantime, Nadara had left the room, her little chin high in air. Never again, she determined, would she subject herself to the insults of Thander's mother. She went on deck. She had found it difficult to remain below during the day. She craved the fresh air and the excitement to be found above. The officers had been very nice to her. Stark was much with her. The man had fallen desperately in love with the half-savage girl. As she reached the deck after leaving Mrs. Smith-Jones's cabin, Stark was the first she chanced to meet. She would have preferred being alone, with her sorrow and her anger, but the man joined her. Together they stood by the rail watching the approach of heavy clouds. A storm was about to break over them that had been brewing for several days. Stark knew nothing of what had taken place below, but he saw that the girl was unhappy. He attempted to cheer her. At last he took her hand and stroked it caressingly as he talked with her. Before she could guess his intention, he was pouring words of love and passion into her ears. Nadara drew away. A puzzled frown contracted her brows. "Do not talk so to Nadara," she said. "She does not love you." And then she moved away and went to her cabin. Stark looked after her as she departed. He was thoroughly aroused. Who was this savage girl to repulse him? What would have been her fate but for his well-directed shot? Was not the man who had been pursuing her but acting after the customs of her wild people? He would have taken her by force. That was the only way she would have been taken had she been left upon her own island. That was the only kind of betrothal she knew. It was what she expected. He had been a fool to approach her with the soft words of civilization. They had made her despise him. She would have understood force and loved him for it. Well, he would show her that he could be as primitive as any of her savage lovers. The storm broke. The wind became a hurricane. The Priscilla was forced to turn and flee before the anger of the elements, so that she retraced her course of the past 2 days and then was blown to the north. Stark saw nothing of Nadara during this period. At the end of 36 hours, the wind had died and the sea was settling to its normal quiet. It was the first evening after the storm. The deck of the Priscilla was almost deserted. The yacht was moving slowly along, not far off the shore of one of the many islands that dot that part of the South Seas. Nadara came on deck for a walk before retiring. Stark and 2 sailors were on watch. At sight of the girl, the first officer approached her. He spoke pleasantly, as though nothing had occurred to mar their friendly relations. He talked of the storm and pointed out the black outlines of the nearby shore, and as he talked, he led her toward the stern, out of sight of the sailors forward. Suddenly he turned upon her and grasped her in his arms. With brutal force he crushed her to him, covering her face with kisses. She fought to free herself, but Stark was a strong man. Slowly he forced her to the deck. She beat him in the face and upon the breast, and at last, in the extreme of desperation, she screamed for help. Instantly, he struck her a heavy blow upon the jaw. The slender form of the girl relaxed upon the deck in unconsciousness. Now Stark came to a sudden realization of the gravity of the thing he had done. He knew that when Nadara regained consciousness, his perfidy would come to the attention of Captain Burlingham, and he feared the quiet ex-naval officer more than he did the devil. He looked over the rail. It would be an easy thing to dispose of the girl. He had only to drop her unconscious body into the still waters below. He raised her in his arms and bore her to the rail. The moon shone down upon her face. He looked out over the water and saw the shore so close at hand. There would be a thorough investigation, and the sailors, who had no love for him, as he well knew, would lose no time in reporting that he had been the last to be seen with the girl. Evidently he was in for it, one way or the other. Again he looked down into Nadara's face. She was very beautiful. He wanted her badly. Slowly his glance wandered to the calm waters of the ocean, and on to the quiet shoreline, then back to the girl. For a moment he stood irresolute. Then he stepped to the side of the cabin, where hung a life preserver, to which was attached a long line. He put the life preserver about Nadara, then he lowered her into the ocean. The moment he felt her weight transferred from the lowering rope to the life preserver, he vaulted over the yacht's rail into the dark waters beneath her stern. Nadara did not regain consciousness until Stark had reached shore and was dragging her out upon the beach above the surf. For several minutes after she had opened her eyes, she had difficulty in recalling the events that had immediately preceded Stark's attack upon her. She felt the life belt still about her, and as Stark stooped above her to remove it, she knew that it was he, though she could not distinguish his features. What had happened? Slowly, a realization of the man's bold act forced itself upon her. He had leaped overboard from the Priscilla and swam ashore with her rather than face the consequences of his brutal conduct. Toward her. To a girl reared within the protective influences of civilization, Nadara's position would have seemed hopeless. But Nadara knew naught of other protection than that afforded by her own quick wits and the agility of her swift young muscles. To her it would have seemed infinitely more appalling to have been confined within the narrow limits of the yacht with this man, for their all was strange and new. She still had half feared and mistrusted all aboard the Priscilla except Thander's father and Captain Burlingham. But would they have protected her from Stark? She did not know. Among her own people, only a father, brother, or mate protected a woman from one who sought her against her will, and of these she had none upon the little vessel. But now it was different. Intuitively she knew that upon a savage shore, however strange and unfamiliar it might be, she would have every advantage over the first officer of the Priscilla. His life had been spent close to the haunts of civilization. He knew nothing of the woodcraft that was second nature to her. He might perish in a land of plenty through ignorance of where to search for food, and of what was edible and what was not. This much her early experience with Waldo Emerson had taught her. When their paths first had crossed, Waldo had been as ignorant as a newborn babe. In the craft of life, primeval Nadara had had to teach him everything. Behind them, Nadara heard the gentle soughing of trees, the myriad noises of the teeming jungle night-hand. She smiled. It was inky black about them. Stark had removed the life belt and placed it beneath the girl's head. He thought her still unconscious, perhaps dead. Now he was wringing the water from his clothes, his back toward her. Nadara rose to her feet, noiseless as Nagula. Like a shadow, she melted into the blackness of the jungle that fringed the shore. Careful and alert, she picked her way within the tangled mass for a few yards. At the hole of a large tree, she halted, listening. Then she made a low, weird sound with her lips, listening again for a moment after. This she repeated thrice, and then, seemingly satisfied that no danger lurked above, she swung herself into the low-hanging branches, quickly ascending until she found a comfortable seat where she might rest. In ease, down upon the beach, Stark, having wrung the surplus water from his garments, turned to examine and revive the girl, if she still lived. Even in the darkness, her form had been plainly visible against the yellow sand, but now she was not there. Stark was dumbfounded. His eyes leaped quickly from one point to another, yet nowhere could they discover the girl. There was the beach, the sea, and the jungle. Which had she chosen for her flight? It did not take Stark long to guess, and immediately he turned his steps toward the shapeless, gloomy mass that marked the forest's fringe. As he approached, he went more slowly. The thought of entering that forbidding wood sent cold shivers creeping through him. Could a mere girl have dared its nameless horrors? She must have, and with the decision came new resolution. What a girl had dared, certainly he might dare. Again he strode briskly toward the jungle. Just at its verge he heard a low, weird sound not a dozen paces within the black, hideous tangle. It was Nadara voicing the two notes which some ancient forebear of her tribe had discovered would ring an answering growl from Nagula, and an uneasy hiss from that other arch-enemy of man, the great slimy serpent whose sinuous coils twined threateningly above them in the branches of the trees. Only these Nadara feared, these in man. So, before entering a tree at night, it was her custom to assure herself that neither Nagula nor Kuvra lurked in the branches of the tree she had chosen for sanctuary. Stark beat a hasty retreat, nor did he again venture from the beach during the balance of the long, dismal night. When dawn broke, it found Nadara much refreshed by the sleep she had enjoyed within the comparative safety of the great tree. and Stark haggard and exhausted by a sleepless night of terror and regret. He cursed himself, the girl and his bestial passion. And then, as his thoughts conjured her lovely face and perfect figure before his mind's eye, he leaped to his feet and swung briskly toward the jungle. He would find her. All that he had sacrificed should not be in vain. He would find her and keep her. Together they would make a home upon this tropical shore. He would get everything out of life that there was to get. He had taken but a few steps before he discovered, plain in the damp sand before him, the prints of Nadara's naked feet, in a well-defined trail leading toward the wood. With a smile of satisfaction and victory, the man followed it into the maze of vegetation, dank and gloomy even beneath the warm light of the morning sun. By chance he stumbled directly upon Nadara. She had descended from her tree to search for water. They saw each other simultaneously. The girl turned and fled farther into the forest. Close behind her came the man. For several hundred yards, the chase led through the thick jungle, which terminated abruptly at the edge of a narrow, rock-covered clearing, beyond which loomed sheer, precipitous cliffs, raising their lofty heads 300 feet above the forest. A half-smile touched Stark's lips as he saw the barrier that nature had placed in the path of his quarry. But almost instantly, it froze into an expression of horror as a slight noise to his right attracted his attention from the girl. Fleeing before him, for an instant he stood bewildered. Then a quick glance toward the girl revealed her scaling the steep cliff with the agility of a monkey. And with a cry to attract her attention, he leaped after her once more. But this time himself, the quarry, the hunter, become the hunted. For after him raced a score of painted savages, brandishing long slim spears, or waving keen-edged parangs. Nadara had not needed Stark's warning cry to apprise her of the proximity of the wild men. She had seen them the instant that she cleared the jungle, and with the sight of them she knew that she need no longer harbor fear of the white man. In them, though, she saw a graver danger for herself, since they, doubtless, would have little difficulty in overhauling her in their own haunts, while she had not had much cause for worry as to her ability to elude the white man indefinitely. Partway up the cliffs, she paused to look back. Stark had reached the foot of the lowering escarpment a short distance ahead of his pursuers. He had chosen this route because of the ease with which the girl had clambered up the rocky barrier, but he had reckoned without taking into consideration the lifetime of practice which lay back of Nadara's agility. From earliest infancy, she had lived upon the face and within the caves of steep cliffs. Her first toddling baby footsteps had been along the edge of narrow shelving ledges. When the man reached the cliff, however, he found confronting him an apparently unscalable wall. He cast a frightened, appealing glance at the girl far above him. Twice he essayed to scramble out of reach of the advancing savages, whose tattooed faces, pendulous slit ears, and sharp-filed, blackened teeth lent to them a more horrid aspect than even that imparted by their murderous weapons or warlike whoops and actions. Each time he slipped back, clutching frantically at rocky projections and such hardy vegetation as had found foothold in the crevices of the granite. His hands were torn and bleeding, his face scratched and his clothing rent. And now the savages were upon him. They had seen that he was unarmed. No need as yet for spear or parang, they would take him alive. And the girl? They had watched her in amazement as she clambered swiftly up the steep ascent. With all their primitive accomplishments, this was beyond even them. They were a forest people and a river people. They dwelt in thatched houses, raised high upon long piles. They knew little or nothing of the arts of the cliff dwellers. To them, the feat of this strange, white girl was little short of miraculous. Nadara saw them seize roughly upon the terror-stricken Stark. She saw them bind his hands behind his back, and then she saw them turn their attention once more toward herself. 3 of the warriors attempted to scale the cliff after her. Slowly they ascended. She smiled at their manifest fear and their awkwardness. She need have no fear of these. They never could reach her. She permitted them to approach within a dozen feet of her, and then, loosening a bit of the crumbling granite, she hurled it full at the head of the foremost. With a yell of pain and terror, he toppled backward upon those below him, the 3 tumbling, screaming, and pawing to the rocks at the base of the cliff. None of them was killed, though all were badly bruised, and he who had received her missile bled profusely from a wound upon his forehead. Their fellows laughed at them. It was scant comfort they received for being bested by a girl. Then they withdrew a short distance, and squatting in a circle, commenced a lengthy palaver. Their repeated gestures in her direction convinced Nadara that she was the subject of their debate. Presently, one of their number arose and approached the foot of the cliff. There he harangued the girl. For several minutes. When he was done, he awaited, evidently for a reply from her. But as Nadara had not been able to understand a word of the fellow's language, she could but shake her head. The spokesman returned to his fellows, and once again a lengthy council was held. During it, Nadara climbed farther aloft, that she might be out of range of the slender spears. Upon a narrow ledge she halted, gathering about her such loose bits of rock as she could dislodge from the face of the cliff. She would be prepared for a sudden onslaught, nor for a moment did she doubt the outcome of the battle. She felt that but for the lack of food and water, she could hold this cliff face forever against innumerable savages. Could they climb no better than these? But the wild men did not again attempt to storm her citadel. Instead, they leaped suddenly from their council, and without a glance toward her, disappeared in the forest, taking their prisoner with them. Out of sight of the girl, they stationed 2 of their number just within the screening verdure, to capture the girl should she descend. The others hastened parallel with the cliff, until a sudden turn inland took them to a point from which they could again emerge into the clearing out of the sight of Nadara. Here they took immediately to a well-worn path that led back and forth upward across the face of the cliff. Stark was dragged and prodded forward with them in their ascent. Sharp spears and the points of keen parry urged him to haste. By the time the party reached the summit, the white man was bleeding from a score of superficial wounds. Now the party turned back along the top of the bluff in the direction from which they had come. Nadara, unable to fathom their reason for having abandoned the attempt to capture her, was, however, not lulled into any feeling of false security. She knew the cliff was the safest place for her, and yet the pangs of thirst and hunger warned her that she must soon leave it to seek sustenance. She was about to descend to the jungle below in search of food and water, when the faintest of movements of the earth, sweeping creepers, depending from a giant buttress tree below her, and just within the verge of the forest, arrested her acute attention. She knew that the movement had been caused by some animal beneath the tree, and finally, as she watched intently, for a moment or two she descried through an opening in the wall of verdure, the long feathers of an Argus pheasant, with which the war caps of the savages had been adorned. Though she knew now that she was watched, she also knew that she could reach the top of the cliff and possibly find both food and drink, if it chanced to be near, before the savages could overtake her. Then she must depend upon her wits and her speed to regain the safety of the cliff ahead of them. That they would attempt to scale the barrier at the same point at which she had climbed it, she doubted, for she had seen that they were comparatively unaccustomed to this sort of going, and so she guessed that if they followed her upward at all, it would be by means of some beaten trail of which they had knowledge. And so Nadara scaled the heights, passing over and around obstacles that would have blanched the cheek of the hardiest mountain climber, with the ease and speed of the chamois. At the summit, she found an open, park-like forest, and into this she plunged, running forward in quest of food and drink. A few familiar fruits and nuts assuaged the keenest pangs of hunger. But nowhere could she find water or signs of water. She had traveled for almost a mile, directly inland from the coast, when she stumbled, purely by chance, upon a little spring hidden in a leafy bower. The cool, clear water refreshed her, imparting to her new life and energy. After drinking her fill, she sought some means of carrying a little supply of the priceless liquid back to her cliffside refuge. But though she searched diligently, she could discover no growing thing which might be transformed into a vessel. There was nothing for it then other than to return without the water, trusting to her wits to find the means of eluding the savages from time to time, as it became necessary for her to quench her thirst. Later, she was sure she should discover some form of gourd, or the bladder of an animal in which she could hoard a few precious drops. Her woodcraft, combined with her almost uncanny sense of direction, led her directly back to the spot at which she had topped the cliff. There was no sign of the savages. She breathed a sigh of relief as she stepped to the edge of the forest, and then, all about her, from behind trees and bushes, rose the main body of the wild men. With shouts of savage glee, they leaped upon her. There was no chance for flight in every direction. Brutal faces and murderous weapons barred her way. With greater consideration than she had looked forward to, they signaled her to accompany them. Stark was with them. To him, slight humanity was shown. If he lagged, a spear point, already red with his blood, urged him to greater speed. But to the girl no cruelty nor indignity was shown. In single file, the prisoners in the center of the column, the party made its way inland. All day they marched, until Stark, unused to this form of exertion, staggered and fell a dozen times in each mile. Nadera could almost have found it in her heart to be sorry for him, had it not been for the fact that she realized all too keenly that but for his own bestial brutality neither of them need have been there. To be subjected to the present torture, and to be tortured by anticipation of the horrors to come. To the girl, it seemed that her fate must be 1,000-fold more terrible than the mere death the man was to suffer. For that these degraded savages would let him live seemed beyond the pale of reason. She prayed to the God of which her Thander had taught her for a quick and merciful death. Yet while she prayed, she well knew that no such boon could be expected. She compared her captors with Korth and Flatfoot, with Big Fist and Thurg, nor did she look for greater compassion in them than in the men she had known best. Late in the afternoon, it became evident that Stark could proceed no farther unless the savages carried him. That they had any intention of so doing was soon disproved. The first officer of the Priscilla had fallen for the 20th time. A dozen vicious spear thrusts had failed to bring him, staggering and tottering, to his feet as in the past. The chief of the party approached the fallen wight, kicking him in the sides and face, and at last pricking him with the sharp point of his parang. Stark but lay an inert mass of suffering flesh, and groaned. The chief grew angry. He grasped the white man around the body and raised him to his feet, but the moment that he released him, Stark fell to earth once more. At last the warrior could evidently control his rage no further. With a savage whoop he swung his parang aloft, bringing it down full upon the neck of the prostrate wight. The head, grinning horribly, rolled to Nadera's feet. She looked at it, lying there staring up at her, out of its blank and sightless eyes, without the slightest trace of emotion. Nadera, the cave girl, was accustomed to death in all its most horrible and sudden forms. She saw before her but the head of an enemy. It was nothing to her. Stark had only himself to thank. The chief gathered the severed head into a bit of bark cloth, and fastening it to the end of his spear, signaled his followers to resume the journey. On and on they went, farther into the interior, and with them went Nadara, born to what nameless fate she could but guess. 2 days after the earthquake that had saved Nadera from Thurg, and wiped out the people of the girl's tribe, a man moved feebly beneath the tumbled debris from the rooftop of his clogged cavern. It was Thander. The tons of rock that had toppled from above and buried the entrance to his cave had passed him by unscathed, while the few pounds shaken from the ceiling had stunned him into a long-enduring insensibility. Slowly he regained consciousness, but it was a long time before he could marshal his faculties to even a slight appreciation of the catastrophe that had overwhelmed him. Then his first thought was of Nadara. He crawled to what had once been the entrance of his cave. He had not as yet linked the darkness to its real cause. He thought at night. It had been night when he closed his eyes. How could he guess that that had been 3 nights before, or all the cruel blows that fate had struck him since he slept? At the opening from the cave, he met his first surprise and set back. The way was blocked. What was the meaning of it? He tugged and pushed weakly upon the mass that barred him from escape. Who had imprisoned him? He recalled the vivid dream in which he had seen Nadara stolen away by Thurg. The recollection sent him frantically at the pile of shattered rock and loose debris which choked the doorway. To his chagrin, he found himself too weak to direct any long-sustained effort against the obstacle. It occurred to him that he must have been injured. Whoever imprisoned him must first have beaten him. He felt of his head. Yes, there was a great gash, but his touch told him that it was not a new one. How long, then, had he been imprisoned? As he sat pondering this thing, he became aware of the gnawing of hunger and the craving of thirst within his slowly awakening body. The sensations were almost painful, so much so that they forced him to a realization of the fact that he must have been without food or water for a considerable time. Again he assailed the mass that held him prisoner. and as he burrowed slowly into it, the truth dawned upon him. He recalled the rumblings of the great Nagula that had frightened Nadara the night of the council. A terrific quake had done this thing. Thander shuddered as he thought of Nadara. Was she, too, imprisoned in her cave, or had the worst happened her? Frantically, now, he tore at the close-packed rubble. But he soon discovered that not in ill-directed haste lay his means of escape. Slowly and carefully, piece by piece, he must remove the broken rock until he had tunneled through to the outer world. Reason told him that he was not deeply buried, for the fact that he lived and could breathe was sufficient proof that fresh air was finding its way through the debris, which it could not have done did the stuff lie before the cave in any considerable thickness. Weak as he was, he could work but slowly, so that it was several hours later before he caught the first glimpse of daylight beyond the obstacle. After that he progressed more rapidly, and presently he crawled through a small opening to view the wreckage of the shattered cliff. A flock of vultures rose from their hideous feast as the sight of Thander disturbed them. The man shuddered as he looked down upon the grisly things from which they had risen. Forgetting his hunger and his thirst, he scrambled up over the tortured cliff face to where Nadara's cave had been. Its mouth was buried as his had been. Again he set to work, but this time it was easier. When at last he had opened a way within, he hesitated, for fear of the blighting sorrow that awaited him. At last, nerving himself to the ordeal, he crawled within the cave that had been groping about in the darkness, expecting each moment to feel the body of his loved one cold in death. He at last covered the entire floor. There was no body within. Hastily he made his way to the face of the cliff again, and then commenced a horrible and pitiful search among the ghastly remnants of men and women that lay scattered about among the tumbled rocks. But even here, his search was vain, for the ghoulish scavengers had torn from their prey every shred of their former likenesses. Weak, exhausted, sorrow-ridden and broken, Thander dragged himself painfully to the little river. Here he quenched his thirst and bathed his body. After, he sought food, and then he crawled to a hole he knew of in the riverbank, and curling up upon the dead grasses within, slept the sun around. Refreshed and strengthened by his sleep and the food that he had taken, Thander emerged from his dark warren with renewed hope. Nadara could not be dead. It was impossible. She must have escaped and be wandering about the island. He would search for her until he found her. But as day followed day, and still no sign of Nadara or any other living human being, he became painfully convinced that he alone of the inhabitants of the island had survived the cataclysm. The thought of living on through a long life without her cast him into the blackest pit of despair. He reproached heaven for not having taken him as well, for without Nadara, life was not worth the living. With the passage of time, his grief grew more rather than less acute. As it increased, so too increased the horror of his loneliness. The island became a hated thing, life, a mockery. The chances that a vessel would touch the shore again during his lifetime seemed remote indeed, unless his father sent out a relief party. But in his despair he did not even hope for such a contingency. He would not take his own life, though the temptation was great, but he courted death in every form that the savage island owned. He slept out upon the ground at night. He sought Nagula in his lair, and armed only with his light lance, he leaped to close quarters with every one of the great cats he could find. The wild boars, often as formidable as Nagula himself, were hunted now as they never had been hunted before. Thander lived high those days, and many were the panther pelts that lined his newfound cave in the cliff beside the sea, same cliff in which Nadara had found shelter, and from whence she had gone away with the search party from the Priscilla. One day as Thander was returning from the beach where he often went to scan the horizon for a sail, he saw something moving at the foot of his cliff. Thander dropped behind a bush, watching. A moment later the thing moved again, and Thander saw that it was a man. Instantly he sprang to his feet and ran forward. The days that he had been without human companionship had seemed to drag themselves into as many weary months. Now he had reached the pinnacle of loneliness, from which he would gladly have embraced the devil had he come in human guise. Thander ran noiselessly. He was almost upon the man, a great, hairy brute, before the fellow was aware of his presence. At first, the fellow turned to run, but when he saw that Thander was alone, he remained to fight. "I am Roof," he cried, "and I can kill you." The familiar primitive greeting no longer raised Thander's temperature or filled him with the fire of battle. He wanted companionship now, not a quarrel. "I am Thander," he replied. The slow-witted hulking brute recognized him and stepped back a pace. He was not so keen to fight now that he had learned the identity of the man who faced him. He had seen Thander in battle. He had witnessed Thurg's defeat at the hands of this smooth-skinned stranger. "Let us not fight," continued Thander. "We are alone upon the island. I have seen no other than you since the great Nagula came forth and destroyed the people. Let us be friends, hunting together in peace. Otherwise one of us must kill the other, and thereafter live always alone until death releases him from his terrible solitude." Roof peered over, Thander's shoulder toward the wood behind him. "Are you alone?" he asked. "Yes, have I not told you that all were killed but you and I?" "All were not killed," replied Roof, "but I will be friends with Thander. We will hunt together and cave together. Roof and Thander are brothers." He stooped, and gathering a handful of grass, advanced toward the American. Thander did likewise, and when each had taken the peace offering of the other and rubbed it upon his forehead, the ceremony of friendship was complete. Simple but nonetheless effectual, for each knew that the other would rather die than disregard the primitive pact. "You said that all were not killed, Roof," said Thander, the ceremony over. "What do you mean?" "All were not killed by the great Nagula," replied the bad man. "Thurg was not killed, nor was she who was Thander's mate she whom Thurg would have stolen." "What?" Thander almost screamed the question. "Nadara not dead." "Look," said Roof, and he led the way to the foot of the cliff. "See, yes," replied Thander. "I had noticed that body, but what of it?" "It was Thurg," explained Roof. "He sought to reach your mate, who had taken refuge in that cave far above us. Then came some strange men who made a great noise with sticks, and Thurg fell dead. The loud noise had killed him from a great distance. Then came the strange men, and she whom you call Nadara went away with them." "In which direction?" cried Thander. "Where did they take her?" "They took her to the strange cliff in which they dwelt, the one in which they came. Never saw man such a thing as this cliff. It floated upon the face of the water. About its face were many tiny caves, but the people did not come out of these, they came from the top of the cliff, and clambering down the sides floated ashore in hollow things of wood. On top of the cliff were 2 trees without leaves, and only very short, straight branches. When the cliff went away, black smoke came out of it from a short black stump of a tree between the 2 trees. It was a very wonderful thing to see, but the most wonderful of all were the noise sticks that killed Thurg and Nagula. A long way off, not half of Roof's narrative did Thander hear. Through his brain roared and thundered a single mighty thought: Nadara lives, Nadara lives. Life took on a new meaning to him now. He trembled at the thought of the chances he had been taking. Now indeed must he live. He leaped up and down, laughing and shouting. He threw his arms about the astonished Roof, whirling the troglodyte about in a mad waltz. Nadara lives, Nadara lives. Once again the sun shone, the birds sang. Nature was her old, happy, carefree self. Nadara was alive and among civilized men, but then came a doubt. Did Nadara go willingly with these strangers? He asked Roof. Or did they take her by force? They did not take her by force, replied Roof. They talked with her for a time, and then she took the hand of one of the men in hers, stroking it, and he placed his arm about her. Afterward, they walked slowly to the edge of the great water, where they got into the strange things that had brought them to the land, and returned to their floating cliff. Presently the smoke came out, as I have told you, and the cliff went away, toward the edge of the world. But they are all dead now. What? Yelled Thander. Yes, I saw the cliff sink very slowly when it was a long way off, until only the smoke was coming out of the water. Thander breathed a sigh of relief. Point, he said, to the place where the cliff sank beneath the water. Roof pointed almost due north. There, he said. For days Thander puzzled over the possible identity of the ship and the men, with whom Nadara had gone so willingly. Doubtless some kindly mariner, hearing her story, had taken her home, away from the terrors and the loneliness of this unhappy island. And now the man chafed to be after her, that he might search the world. For his lost love, to wait for a ship appeared quite impossible to the impatient Thander, for he knew that a ship might never come. There was but one alternative, And had Waldo Emerson been a less impractical man in the world to which he had been born, he would have cast aside that single alternative as entirely beyond the pale of possibility. But Waldo was only practical and wise in the savage ways of the primitive life to which circumstance had forced him to revert, and so he decided upon as foolhardy and harebrained a venture as the mind of man might conceive. It was no less a thing than to build a boat and set out upon the broad Pacific in search of a civilized port or a vessel that might bear him to such. To Waldo it seemed quite practical. He realized, of course, that the venture would be fraught with peril. But would it not be better to die in an attempt to find his Nadara than to live on forever in the hopelessness of this forgotten land? And so he set to work to build a boat. He had no tools but his crude knife and the razor the sailor of the Sally Corwith had given him, so it was quite impossible for him to construct a dugout. The possibilities that lie in fire did not occur to him. Finally, he hit upon what seemed the only feasible form of construction. With his knife he cut long, pliant saplings and lesser branches. These he fashioned into the framework of a boat. Ruth helped him, keenly interested in this new work. The ribs were fastened to the keel and gunwale by thongs of panther skin, and when the framework was completed, panther skins were stretched over it. The edges of the skin were sewn together with threads of gut, as tightly as Thander and Ruth could pull them. A mast was rigged well forward, and another panther skin from which the fur had been scraped was fitted as a sail, square-rigged. For rudder, Thander fashioned a long, slender sapling, looped at one end, and the loop covered with skin laced tightly on. This, he figured, would serve both as rudder and paddle, as necessity demanded. At last, all was done. Together, Thander and Ruth carried the light, crude skiff to the ocean. They waded out beyond the surf, and upon the crest of a receding swell, they launched the thing, Thander leaping in as it floated upon the water. The sail was not taken along for this trial. Thander merely wished to know that this craft would float, and right side up. For a moment it did so, until the sea, rushing in at the loose seams, filled it with water. Thander and Ruth had great difficulty in dragging it out again upon the beach. Ruth now would have given up, but not so Thander. It is true that he was slightly disheartened, for he had set great store upon the success of his little vessel. After they had carried the frail thing beyond high tide, Thander sat down upon the ground, and for an hour he did not but stare at the leaky craft. Then he arose, and calling to Ruth led him into the forest. For a mile they walked, and then Thander halted before a tree from the side of which a thick and sticky stream was slowly oozing. Thander had brought along a gourd, and now with a small branch, he commenced transferring the mass from the side of the tree to the gourd. Ruth helped him. In an hour the gourd was filled. Then they returned to the skiff. Leaving the gourd there, Thander and Ruth walked to a clump of heavy jungle grasses, not far from the cliff where their cave lay. Here Thander gathered a great armful of the yellow ripened grass, telling Ruth to do likewise. This they took back to the skiff, where, by rolling it assiduously between their hands and pounding it with stones, they reduced it to a mass of soft, tough fiber. Now Thander showed Ruth how to twist this fiber into a loose, fluffy rope. And when he had him well started, he daubed the rope with the rubbery fluid he had filched from the tree, and with a sharp stick tucked it in every seam and crevice of the skiff. It took the better part of 2 days to accomplish this, and when it was done and the gourd empty, the two men returned to the tree and refilled it. This time they built a fire upon their return to the skiff, Ruth spinning a hard wood splinter rapidly between toes and fingers, in a little mass of tinder that lay in a hollowed piece of wood. Presently a thin spiral of smoke arose from the tinder, growing denser for a moment, until of a sudden it broke into flame. The men piled twigs and branches upon the blaze until the fire was well started. Then Thander, taking a ball of the viscous matter from the gourd, heated it in the flames, immediately daubing the melting mass upon the outside of the skiff. In this way, slowly and with infinite patience, the two at last succeeded in coating the entire outer surface of the canoe with a waterproof substance that might defy the action of water almost indefinitely. For 3 days Thander let the coating dry, and then the craft was given another trial. The man's heart was in his throat as the canoe floated upon the crest of a great wave, and he leaped into it. But a moment later he shouted in relief and delight. The thing floated like a cork, nor was there the slightest leak discernible. For half an hour, Thander paddled about the harbor, and then he returned for the sail. This too, though rather heavy and awkward, worked admirably, and the balance of the day he spent in sailing, even venturing out into the ocean. Much of the time he paddled, for Waldo Emerson knew more of the galleys of ancient Greece than he did of sails or sailing, so that for the most part, he sailed with the wind, paddling when he wished to travel in another direction. But withal, his attempt filled him with delight, and he could scarce wait to be off toward civilization and Natera. The next 2 days were spent in collecting food and water, which Thander packed in numerous gourds, sealing the mouths with the rubbery substance such as he had used to waterproof his craft. The flesh of wild hog, and deer, and bird he cut in narrow strips and dried over a slow fire. In this work Ruth assisted him, and at last all was in readiness for the venture. The day of his departure dawned bright and clear. A gentle south wind gave promise of great speed toward the north. Thander was wild with hope and excitement. Ruth was to accompany him, but at the last moment the nerve of the troglodyte failed him, and he ran away and hid in the forest. It was just as well, thought Thander, for now his provisions would last twice as long, and so he set out upon his perilous adventure, braving the mighty Pacific in a frail and unseaworthy cockleshell, with all the assurance and confidence that is ever born of ignorance. Nature so far had been kind to Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones. No high winds or heavy seas had assailed him, and he had been upon the water for 3 days now. The wind had held steadily out of the south. Even so, Waldo Emerson was commencing to doubt and to worry. His supply of water was running dangerously low. His food supply would last but a few days longer, and as yet he had sighted no sail, nor seen any land. Furthermore, he had not the remotest conception of how he might retrace his way to the island he had just quitted. He could only sail before the wind. Should the wind veer around into the north, he might, by chance, be blown back to the island. Otherwise, he never could reach it, and he was beginning to wonder if he had not been a trifle too precipitate in his abandonment of land. In common with most other landsmen, Waldo Emerson had little conception of the vastness of the seas. His recollection of maps pictured the calm and level blue dotted, especially in the South Seas, with many islands. Their names were reassuring. The Society Islands, the Friendly Islands, Christmas Island. He hoped he would land upon one of these. There were so many islands upon the maps, and they seemed so close together that he was mystified he had failed to sight several hundred long before this. And ships, it appeared incredible that he should have seen not a single sail. He recalled the atlas he had examined prior to embarking upon his health cruise. The Pacific had been lined in all directions with steamer routes, and between them, Waldo had felt the ocean must be dotted with the innumerable tramps that come and go. And yet for 3 days nothing had broken the dull monotony of the vast circle of which he was always the center and the sole occupant. In 3 days, thought Waldo, he must have covered an immense distance, and 3 more days dragged their weary lengths. The wind had died to the faintest of breezes. The canoe was just making headway, and that was all. The water was gone, the food nearly so. Waldo was suffering from lack of the former. The pitiless sun beating down upon him increased his agony. He stretched his panther skin across the stern, and hid beneath it from the torrid rays. And there he lay until darkness brought relief. During the night the wind sprang up again, but this time from the west. It rose, and with it rose the sea. The man, clinging to his crude steering blade, struggled to keep the light craft straight before the wind, howling fearfully. Great waves, hungry and wide-jawed, raced after him like a pack of ravenous wolves. Thander knew the unequal struggle against the mighty forces of the elements could not endure for long. It seemed that each fierce gust must tear his frail boat to shreds, and yet the very lightness of the thing saved it, for it rode upon the crests of waves, blown forward at terrific velocity, like a feather before the hurricane. In Thander's heart was no terror, only regret that he might never again see his mother, his father, or his Nadara. Yet the night wore on, and still he fled before the storm. The sky was overcast, the darkness impenetrable. He imagined all about him, still the same wide, tenantless circle of water, only now torn, perpendicular and black, instead of peaceful and soothingly blue-green. And then came a thunderous booming loud above the storm. His boat was lifted high in air, to dive headforemost into what might be a bottomless abyss. but it was not bottomless. The canoe struck something and stopped suddenly, pitching Thander out into a boiling maelstrom. A great wave picked him up, carrying him with racehorse velocity within its crest. He felt himself hurled pitilessly upon smooth, hard sand. The water tried to drag him back, but he clutched the surface with toes and fingers. Then the wave abandoned him and raced swiftly back into the sea. Thander was exhausted, but he knew that he must crawl up out of the way of the surf, or be dragged back by the next roller. He had found land at last. What he had searched for in vain through 6 long days he had run down in the midst of a Stygian night. He wondered if some terrible convulsion of nature had not swallowed up all the land in the world, leaving only a waste of desolate water. He forgot his hunger and his thirst in the happiness of the knowledge that once more he was upon land. He hoped that dawn would reveal the chimneys and steeples of a nearby city. Exhausted, he fell into a deep sleep. It was the sun shining into his upturned face that awoke him. He was lying upon his back beside a clump of bushes above the beach. About to rise and survey the new world, he heard a familiar sound upon the opposite side of his bush. It was the movement of an animal creeping through long grass. Thander came noiselessly to his hands and knees, peering through branches. What he saw sent his hand groping for his wooden sword with its fire-hardened point. There, not 5 paces from him, was a man going cautiously upon all fours. It was the most horrible man Thander had ever seen. Eventharg appeared lovely by comparison. The creature's ears were split, his face cicatrized and tattooed. The teeth were black and pointed. A headdress of long feathers waved above the hideous face. The arms, legs, and abdomen were tattooed. The breasts circled with designs. In his belt lay a sword, and in his hand he carried a long spear. The warrior was creeping stealthily upon something at Thander's left. Looking, Thander discerned a figure moving along the beach. The quarry was a man strangely garbed in many colors, with yellow jacket, red sash, and blue trousers. A crimson cloth wound around his head. The features of the man were Mongolian. The warrior paused, then rose with sword drawn. The Mongol wheeled, pistol in hand, but it missed fire. At that instant, Thander leaped into the fray. With drawn sword, he rushed upon the savage. Awed by the impetuosity of the attack, the wild man turned to flee, but Thander was upon him. The sharp point entered his back beneath the shoulder blade. The savage shrieked and fell dead. Thander turned toward the man he had rescued. The latter approached, talking excitedly. It was clear he was thanking Thander, though the American could not understand his tongue. Then the man tried pidgin English, broken, but familiar. Thander, hungry and thirsty, made signs of his need. The stranger understood, motioning him to follow. Around a promontory they came to a cove, where nearly a score of men like the stranger were camped, preparing breakfast by their boat. At sight of Thander, they stared in astonishment, but after hearing the tale they greeted him warmly, furnishing food and water. For 3 days Thander worked with them, slowly learning their story in their bastard tongue. He realized he was among pirates, Chinese, Japanese, the offscourings of the South Seas, discredited even among their own kind. Their leader was So Ming, the Chinaman whose life Thander had saved. He learned their prahu had been wrecked in the storm a month before, and since then they had been building a new craft, battling skirmishes with headhunters. Only yesterday one of their men had been killed, another captured by savages. These savages were ferocious headhunters, preferring ambush to fair fight. The pirates lived in constant fear. Their boat was almost complete. 2 more days would see it launched, and So Ming promised Thander passage to civilization. On the 3rd day, an exhausted, blood-smeared man staggered into Camp Pit was Balloon, who had been captured. Revived with food and water, he told of a strange temple where he had seen a white goddess clad in a black panther skin. He swore she was white, with black hair, and a great diamond upon her left hand. Thander trembled. Could it be Nadara? He vowed to go inland, to the temple. So Ming warned him against it, but Thander set out with spear, parang, and pistol. 2 days later, he crept into the village by moonlight. Beneath the houses, he crawled toward the temple, guarded by 2 warriors. Spotting a leaning pole weighted with burdens, he climbed it silently to the wooden roof. Prying away shingles with his parang, he made an opening and dropped inside. Moonlight revealed a platform, and upon it lay a woman wrapped in Nagula's hide. Her black hair spilled across her arm. Upon her finger blazed a diamond. Thander's heart leapt. It was Nadara. He dropped to the floor. She awoke, terrified, believing him dead. He reassured her, and she sobbed in his arms. But then she warned him the guard. Someone was entering the temple. 2 warriors rushed in. Thander shot one with his pistol, but his powder was scarce. Nadara, quick-witted, seized a spear and slew the second, saving him. She urged him to escape, but Thander vowed they would live or die together. They tore up floorboards, dropped beneath the temple, and fled toward the jungle. Pursued by a horde, they ran all night. By noon they reached the pirate camp, but So Ming had sailed. Only Thander's repaired canoe remained. Together they dragged it to the sea. A horde of headhunters charged. Thander fired, striking one. Then, lifting the canoe above his head, he plunged into the surf with Nadara at his side. A wave swept away pursuers, dragging them down. The baffled savages raged upon the beach. But Thander and Nadara crawled into their canoe, riding the tide into the Pacific. Safely, as the tide and wind carried the light craft out to sea, and the shoreline sank beneath the horizon behind them. Waldo Emerson looked out upon the future as he did upon the tumbling waste of desolate water encircling them, with utter hopelessness. Once before he had passed by a miracle through the many-sided menaces of the sea. But that he should be so fortunate again, he could not hope. And now Nadara was with him. Before, only his own suffering and death had been possible. Now he must face the greater agony of witnessing Nadara's. The wind, blowing a steady gale, was raising a considerable sea. The vast billows rolled, one upon the heels of another, with the regularity of infantry units doubling at review. The wind and the sea seemed to have been made to order for the frail vessel that bore Thander and Nadara. It rode the long ponderous waves like a cork. Its crude sail caught the wind and bellied bravely to it, driving the boat swiftly over the water. And scarce had the shore behind them sunk forever from their sight than dead ahead another shoreline showed. Thander could scarce believe his eyes. He rubbed them and looked again. Then he asked Nadara to look. "What is that ahead?" he asked. The girl half rose with an exclamation of joy. "Land," she cried, and land it was. The wind, driving them madly, carried them toward the north end of what appeared to be a large island. Angry breakers pounded a rocky coastline. To strike there would mean instant death to them both. But would they strike? As they neared the point of the island, it became evident to Thander that they would be borne past it. Could he hope to stem the speed and turn back into shelter? The chances were more than even that the canoe would capsize the instant he cut away the sail and attempted to paddle across the wind. Ass would be necessary to come about the end of the island, but there seemed no other way. He handed his part to Nadara, telling her to be ready to cut the rawhide strips that supported the sail the instant that he gave the word. With his paddle clutched tightly in his hands, he knelt in the stern, watching the progress of the canoe past the rocky point. At this extremity of the island, a narrow tongue of land ran far out into the sea. It was past the outer point of this tongue that the canoe was racing. When they had passed, Thander realized the rashness of attempting to turn the canoe into the trough of the sea, even for the little distance that would have been necessary to make the shelter of the point, where, almost within reach, he could see the peaceful bosom of unruffled water lying safely behind the island. And yet, as he looked ahead upon the limitless waste of ocean before them, he knew that one risk was no greater than the other. And then an alternative plan occurred to him. He would run a short distance past the point and then turn almost directly back and attempt to paddle the canoe in the calm water, running nearly into the face of the wind, thus avoiding the dangers of the trough. There was but a single drawback to this plan: the question of his ability to drive the canoe against the gale. At least it was worth trying. He gave Nadara the word to cut down the sail, and at the same instant, the canoe being upon the crest of a wave, he bent to the paddle. As the panther skin tumbled at the foot of the rough mast, the nose of the craft swung around to his strokes. So intent were both upon the life and death struggle that they were waging with the elements that neither saw the long craft that shot from the mouth of a small harbor behind them as they came into view upon the lee side of the island. For a moment the canoe hung broadside to the wind. Thander struggled frantically to carry it about. Down they dropped into the trough of a great sea. Above them hung the overleaning tower of the wave's crest, ready to topple upon them its tons The canoe rose, still broadside, almost to the crest of the wave. Then the thing broke upon them. When Thander came to the surface, his first thought was for Nadara. He looked about as he shook the water from his eyes. Almost at his side, Nadara's head rose from the sea. As her eyes met his, a smile touched her lips. "This is better," she shouted. "Now we can reach shore." And turning, she struck out for land. Just behind her swam Thander. He knew that Nadara was like a fish in water, but he doubted her ability, as he doubted his own, to reach the shore in the face of both wind and tide. A wave carried them high in air, and from its crest both saw simultaneously a long craft in the hollow beneath them, and noted the fierce aspect of her crew. Nadara, fearing all men but Thander, would have attempted to elude the craft, but the glimpse that the man had had of those aboard her had convinced him that he had fallen by good fortune into the company of Soming and his crew. "They are friends," he screamed to Nadara, and so they let the boat come alongside and pick them up. But no sooner had Thander obtained a good look at the occupants than he discovered that never a face among them had he seen before. They were of the same type as Soming's motley horde, nor did Waldo Emerson need inquire. Their vocation, thief and murderer, were writ upon every countenance. They jabbered questions in assorted dialects, which neither could understand, and it was only after the craft had been anchored in the little bay, and the party had waded to shore, that Thander tried speaking with them in pidgin English. Several among them understood him, and he was not long in making it plain to them that they would be paid well if they carried him and Nadara to a civilized port. The leader, who seemed to be a full-blooded Negro, laughed at him, ridiculing the idea that an almost naked man could pay for his liberty. At the same time, the fellow cast such greedy glances at Nadara that Thander became convinced that the fellow, for reasons of his own, preferred not to believe that they could pay in money for their liberty. It seemed that the party had been about to embark for another portion of the western coast of the island, where the main body of the horde lay. They had but been waiting for 3 of their crew, who had gone inland hunting, when they had seen the canoe and put out to capture its occupants. Now they returned to the little harbor to pick up their fellows, and continue toward the main camp. The black was for dispatching Thander at once, as their boat was already overcrowded, but there were others who counseled him against it, reminding him of the probable anger of their chief, who saw only in a dead prisoner the loss of a possible ransom. At last the hunters returned and all embarked. Soon the boat had passed out of the bay and was making its way south, along the west coast of the island. It was almost dark when her nose was turned toward shore and the long sweeps brought into play as the sail sagged to the foot of the mast, between 2 small, overlapping points that hid what lay behind. They passed into a landlocked harbor. As the boat breasted the end of the inner point, Thander sprang to his feet with a cry of joy and amazement. Not 100 yards away, riding quietly upon the mirror-like surface of the water, lay the Priscilla. The pirates looked at their prisoner in astonishment. The black rose with clenched fists as though prepared to strike him. "Priscilla ahoy!" shrieked Waldo Emerson. "Help! Help!" The Negro grinned. There was no response from the white yacht. Then the men told Thander that they had captured the vessel several weeks before, and were holding her crew prisoners upon land, awaiting the return of the chief, who had been unaccountably absent for a long time. When Waldo Emerson told them that the yacht belonged to his father, the black was glad that he had not killed him, for he should bring a fat ransom. It was dark when they landed, and Thander and Nadara were forced into squalid huts that lay side by side with several others, just above the beach. For a long time, the man could not sleep. His mind was occupied with doubts as to the fate of his father and mother. Nadara had told him that both had been aboard the Priscilla. She had said nothing of the treatment accorded her by Mrs. Smith-Jones, but Waldo had guessed near the truth, and he had seen that the sight of the Priscilla had awakened no enthusiasm or happiness in the girl. After a while he dozed, only to be awakened by the sound of movement. Outside his hut, there was something sinister in the stealthiness of the sound. Silently Thander rose and crept to the door. The pirates had made no attempt to secure their prisoners. There was no possibility of their escaping from the island. Thander put his head out into the lesser darkness of the night. He muttered a little growl of rage and fear, for what he saw was the huge dark bulk of a man crawling into Nadara's hut. Instantly the American followed. At the door he paused, to listen. Within, he heard a sudden exclamation of fright and the sound of a scuffle. Then he was within the darkness, and a moment later stumbled against a man. Thander's fingers sought the throat. He made no sound. The other wheeled with a knife. Thander had expected it. His forearm warded the first blow, and running down the forearm of the other, his hand found the knife wrist. Then commenced the struggle within the Stygian blackness of the hut. Back and forth across the mud floor, the two staggered and reeled, the one attempting to wrench free the hand that held the knife, the other seeking a hold upon the throat of his antagonist while he strove to maintain his grip upon the other's wrist. Their heavy breathing rose and fell. Nadara could not assist. Thander, she knew it was he who had come to her rescue, though she could not see him. At last, with a superhuman effort, the night prowler broke away. For a moment, silence reigned. None could see the other in the blackness. From beneath his panther skin, Thander drew the long pistol that Soming had given him, but he dared not fire for fear of hitting Nadara, nor ask her to speak lest he divulge his position. Minutes that seemed hours, they stood in utter silence. Then Thander heard a cautious movement upon the opposite side of the room. Was it his foe, or Nadara? He raised his pistol level with the man's breast, and very cautiously he too moved to one side. At the slight sound there came a sudden flash and deafening roar from across the hut. The enemy had fired, and in the flash all within was lighted for an instant. And Thander saw the giant black not 2 paces from him, and to the man's left stood Nadara, safe from Thander's shot. The black, not knowing that Thander was armed, had not guessed that his chance shot was to prove his own death messenger. The instant that the flash revealed his whereabouts, Thander's pistol gave an answering roar, and simultaneously he leaped to one side, running swiftly to grapple with the black from the side. But when he came to him, instead of meeting with ferocious resistance as he had expected, he stumbled over his dead body. But now the whole camp was awake, running hither and thither. Confusion reigned supreme, and in the midst of it, Thander grasped Nadara's hand and ran from the hut. Back of the other huts he ran until he had passed the end of the camp. Then he turned down toward the water to reach a boat and the Priscilla. Behind them the confusion grew as the pirates searched the huts for an explanation of the shots. There could have been no better opportunity for escape. Drawn up on the beach was one of the Priscilla's own boats. Together they pushed it off, and a moment later were rowing rapidly toward the yacht. It was with a feeling of unbounded security and elation that Waldo clambered over the side and drew Nadara after him. But scarcely had he set foot upon the deck than he was seized from behind by half a dozen brawny villains who had been upon guard and had lain in wait as they clambered over the side. The balance of the night they were kept prisoners upon the Priscilla. But early the next morning they were taken ashore. There they found all the pirates congregated outside one of the huts. Within were the passengers and crew of the Priscilla. As Thander and Nadara approached, they were seized and hustled toward the doorway with an accompaniment of Oriental oaths. They were pushed inside. Standing about in disconsolate and unhappy groups were the crew, Captain Burlingham and Mr. and Mrs. Smith-Jones. As his eyes fell upon the last, Waldo ran toward her with outstretched arms. With a horrified shriek, Mrs. Smith-Jones dodged behind the men. Waldo came to a sudden halt. The 2 men eyed him threateningly. He looked straight into his father's face. "Don't you know me, father?" he asked. John Alden Smith-Jones' jaw dropped. "Waldo Emerson," he cried. "It cannot be possible." Mrs. Smith-Jones emerged from retreat. "Waldo Emerson," she echoed. "It cannot be, but it is, mother," cried the young man. "What awful apparel," said Mrs. Smith-Jones after she had embraced her son. Then her eyes wandered to Nadara, standing demurely. "You," she gasped. "You are not dead." Nadara shook her head, and Waldo hastened to recount her adventures since Stark's attack upon her on the deck of the Priscilla. Mrs. Smith-Jones approached the girl. She placed a hand upon her shoulder. "I have been doing a great deal of thinking since last I saw you," she said. "And the result of it is that I am going to do something that I have never before done in my life. I am going to ask your pardon. I treated you shamefully. I do not need to ask if my son loves you. You have already told me that you love him, and his eyes have told me where his heart lies. For long nights I lay awake thinking of the horror of it, and almost praying that he might be dead rather than come back. To find you waiting for him in Boston, that was before you went overboard. You had no birth or family, and that to me meant everything. But since I thought that you were both dead, I discovered that I recalled many things about you infinitely preferred. Over birth and breeding. I cannot tell you just what they are only. I cannot blame my son for loving you. Only you must discard that horrible garment for something presentable, mother, shouted Waldo, as he threw his arms about her. I knew it. Come, said a pirate entering. They filed out. They learned it had been decided to kill them all, and after looting the Priscilla, sinker as a man of war had been sighted cruising off the coast. In terror, they would wait no longer for the chief. All thoughts of ransom were forgotten in the mad desire to erase every vestige of their piracy. Entirely surrounded, one by one, the prisoners were securely bound. The plan was to lead them inland, to the densest jungle, and there cut their throats. At last all were bound, and the death march commenced. The last of the long line disappeared in the jungle when a rude craft made its way into the harbor. Seeing the Priscilla, it hesitated, then approached and mounted, finding the decks deserted. In the cabins, the newcomers discovered two Malays asleep. These they awoke with laughter and rude jests. The guards leaped to their feet, felt for pistols, but seeing who had surprised them, grinned broadly and jabbered, addressing a huge villain. He it was whom the pirates had awaited, and whose prolonged absence had resulted in the determination to execute the prisoners. When the chief learned what was going on, he cursed and bellowed, seeing many thousand liangs of sea evaporating before his eyes. Shouting orders, he leaped into the craft and pushed rapidly toward the shore. Without waiting to draw the boat upon the beach, the chief plunged into the jungle, his men at his heels. Far ahead trudged the weary prisoners, lashed onward with sticks. At last the pirates halted in tangled vegetation. Here, said one. Another thought they should proceed further. For a few minutes they argued. Then the first drew his parang and advanced upon Thandor. Here, he insisted and swung the blade aloft. A sudden crashing of underbrush and loud angry shouts caused him to turn. The prisoners looked. They saw, not reassurance only, another ferocious, wrathful pirate, followed by a half-dozen villains. He rushed into the group, knocking men to right and left. The fellows who had bullied and cowed the frightened prisoners now looked the picture of abject terror. The chief halted before the man with the bared parang, face livid, working with rage. He tried to speak, then his eyes fell upon Thandor, bound for death. As his gaze fell upon this prisoner, his eyes went wide. He turned upon the would-be executioner, and with a mighty blow felled him, that loosed his tongue, and from his mouth flowed a torrent of awful abuse, directed at the men who dared this thing. And you would have killed Thandor, he shrieked. Thandor, who saved my life. Then he fell to kicking the prostrate man until Thandor himself interceded. With So Ming's coming, the prisoner's troubles evaporated. For learning the yacht's owner, he restored the Priscilla and all loot to their rightful owners. Nor would he have stopped there had they permitted him, which was to behead half a dozen lieutenants, overzealous in piratical duties. So Ming's men replenished water casks and provisions, sufficient to ensure a plentiful table to Honolulu, chosen as first stop. When preparations were completed, a dozen prahus escorted the white yacht 100 miles northward, firing farewell salutes with volley after volley from brass 6-pounders in their bows. As the tiny fleet diminished to specks astern, a white-flanneled man with close-cropped blonde hair, and a slender black-haired girl in simple shirtwaist and duck skirt, watched them from the Priscilla's deck. An involuntary sigh escaped the lips of each, and they turned and looked into one another's eyes. "We are leaving a cruel world that has been kind to us," said the man. "For with all its cruelties, it gave us each other and reunited us when we were separated. Will civilization be more kind?" asked the girl. Thandor shook his head. "I do not know," he replied. At Honolulu, Waldo Emerson, Smith Jones, and Nadara were married. Before the ceremony, there was debate about what name to use for Nadara in the formal contract. Nadara alone seemed too brief to Mrs. Smith Jones, but Waldo and the girl insisted it was sufficient. So, lacking any other, all agreed Nadara could not be improved upon. Before the Priscilla's on-board ceremony, Mr. and Mrs. Smith Jones, Captain Cecil Burlingham, several invited Honolulu officials and friends, and the crew presented gifts to the bride. Captain Burlingham, offering his gift, explained, "To you, Nadara, these trinkets will mean more than to another, for they come from your forgotten island, where they lay 20 years until I found them by the sea." Their owner was a lady, very beautiful. He held out a worn bag of small rodent skins, sewn with gut. At sight of it, both Nadara and Waldo exclaimed. Nadara took the bag, poured its contents into her palm. Waldo pressed forward, asking Burlingham if he knew to whom the jewels belonged. "To Eugenie Marie, Celeste de la Valois, Countess of Crissy," said the captain. "They belonged to Nadara's mother," Waldo replied, telling how her foster parents witnessed her birth, took the jewels from the dead woman, washed ashore with only a dead man beside her. Thus, when the clergyman performed the marriage, he wrote upon the certificate, in the space for the woman's name, Nadara de la Valois, and so it stood simple, final, and fitting to the mystery of her birth and the truth of her blood. Now they live in Boston, in a wonderful home you may have seen if driven about the city on a great sightseeing motor bus, for the place is pointed out to visitors for the beauty of its architecture and its storied associations. Fame attaches to the historic aristocratic name of its owner, which, as it happens, is not Smith Jones at all.